Hello and welcome to the Weekly Stuff Podcast with Jonathan Lack.
And Sean Chapman.
We are here to talk about stuff. This week on the show, we're talking to Spider-Man again.
We will never not be talking Spider-Man for the foreseeable future, Jonathan.
It's going to be a recurring topic. If for some reason you hate Spider-Man, I don't know who those people are, but if you hate Spider-Man, you might want to listen to a different podcast for the next couple weeks, because we're on a Spider-Man kick.
Yeah, you could cherry pick the news and stuff section. I'm going to talk a little bit about Yakuza Kiwami 2 today, so that's not directly Spider-Man related.
Absolutely. So there will be non-Spider-Man things. We got a little bit of news, we got a little bit of stuff, but our main topic today is we are finally, kind of late, weirdly, for this podcast, I think, diving into a full, in-depth, retrospective discussion of our favorite superhero movie, Spider-Man 2.
Yes. It has been a very long time. Not just our favorite superhero movie, one of my top 10 favorite movies, as we determined recently on that episode of the podcast.
Yes, on episode 200, you called it your 7th favorite movie of all time, I believe. I was re-listening to that segment today. But we are talking about Spider-Man 2 because, again, as you said, Sean, not just one of our favorite movies, our favorite superhero movie. We talk about it, some might say, incessantly on this show because superhero movies are a big thing, if you haven't heard.
Yeah.
And when we talk about superhero movies, we wind up coming back to Spider-Man 2 because I think it's a touchstone, it's a model, it is something that I think determines for us what this genre can do at its best, and I'm very excited to talk about it in full with you today.
Yes, it is certainly the highest benchmark hit so far for superhero movies to me, and it's so much of it, having rewatched it for God knows how many times I've watched this movie, but rewatched it last night again, and just was struck once more by how really kind of perfect a superhero movie it is, and perfect a Spider-Man movie it is, and Spider-Man being my favorite superhero makes me biased to the best Spider-Man movie has to be the best superhero movie, but even outside of that, the way that it captures the essence of the sort of moral dilemma of the superhero and the Marvel model superhero in particular is so perfect. And then all the stuff that is great about Spider-Man 1 that we talked about on last week's episode is here in spades for Spider-Man 2. It's just a phenomenal movie, and it has been a long time coming for us to just do, talk about the movie for longer than the movie is, like we did with Spider-Man 1.
Yes, so if you didn't hear last week's episode, in the run-up to the new Insomniac Spider-Man game for PS4 that we're all excited for, we're just going back and revisiting the Sam Raimi movies. Spider-Man 1 and 2 we love. Spider-Man 3, I honestly don't know at this point. I have not seen it since episode 3 of this podcast, because that's the last time we did a retrospective on the Raimi films, and, we were slackers back then. That episode was probably only 80 minutes long, so fuck it.
Yeah, 80 minutes for 3 movies? That's just ridiculous.
Yeah, that's sane almost.
That's something that a person could listen to.
All right, we're going to talk about Spider-Man at length later today. Let's start with some stuff, though, Sean. To start, I have one piece of half stuff, half housekeeping, which is I have a fun new video up on our YouTube channel.
Oh, yes.
For a class I am teaching later this week, I am TAing currently at the University of Iowa, our Intro to Film class, so the freshman, film class that everyone has to take when they enter the major. And we're going to be talking about narrative next week, so I know I'm going to go through some basics of narrative structure with them, and I'm going to use a film that is not on the syllabus, but one that I think they will all have seen, and so I chose Star Wars, the original Star Wars.
Good choice.
Yeah, it was that or Wizard of Oz, just in terms of movies I know they will have seen, and Wizard of Oz is the one the textbook uses. So, using a different one. And so for that, to give them a little recap, I decided to do a little edit, and I took Spider-Man, Star Wars, and I cut the movie down to 2 minutes, and I'm going to show that to them as the recap, also just to make them laugh because it was silly, and I did it because I had office hours the other day, and those go on for a while, and no one visited me, and I was bored. So
nobody ever
that's what I
shows up
did.
to office hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, I watched the video before we started, and I think you did a good job, Jonathan. I think you get the point of Star Wars across, and then you also have a very good... My favorite part is the dramatic zoom in on the burnt corpses of Owen and Beru.
Yes.
It's a nice little cherry on top.
Yeah, a little preview of what to come. But you can see that on our YouTube channel. I threw it up there because I'm like, hey, I made a video. I might as well put it on our YouTube channel. Because, I don't always put the podcast there anymore because it takes too much work and no one watches it there. But sometimes our silly little videos get a lot of views. So I put that one up. My other favorite thing in the video as a preview is I picked all the most awkward moments out of the lightsaber fight in the original Star Wars and put those in there. Yeah, and those are really funny out of context.
Yeah, it's good. It's very well done.
All right, well, thank you. All right, let's see. Another couple pieces of stuff. I wanted to talk about something. So this is... Okay, I'm going to build up in my stuff from least Spider-Man related to most Spider-Man related, but these are all semi-Spider-Man related.
Okay.
And my first one is the TV show Supergirl, which you all know I love. Mm-hmm. This is not really Spider-Man related. It's DC. It's a TV show. It has almost nothing to do with Spider-Man, except it is a comic book thing. And as I said last week, this TV show, I think, takes a lot of tonal cues from what Sam Raimi did in his movies. So that's one of the reasons I think I love it. I think it just works on that tonal wavelength that I like. But I wanted to mention it, Sean. I'm almost done with season 3, and there's a story arc in the 3rd season of Supergirl that I know you would love, and I just wanted to make sure our listeners know exists, because I can't believe this exists on television. And that is... I've told you before. I've told you about this, Sean, right? That Martian Manhunter is a main character on Supergirl?
Yes, we've talked about that.
Yes, it's John Jones, played by David Harewood. He is mostly in human form because they do not have the budget to have him be a Martian at all times on the show, which I think is understandable, and some Martian is better than no Martian. But he is still John Jones. He still goes to Mars. He still does, weird Martian prayers and stuff. And in the 3rd season... they go back to Mars and they find out his dad was still alive and had been a prisoner of war for 300 years. And so he rescues his dad, whose name is Mirin. I don't know how you spell it. It's got an M and an apostrophe, kind of like Jean does. But they rescue his dad and they bring his dad back to Earth. And his dad is played by Carl Lumley, who is... you might not know him by name, but you would know him by sight and especially sound, because he's a character actor, does a lot of TV, does a lot of vocal work, and in fact, in a lot of the history of DC animation, like the Justice League cartoon, he voiced Martian Manhunter. So
right. Yes,
yeah, so that was a cool casting choice. But the story they choose to tell about Martian Manhunter having his dad back is that his dad has Martian Alzheimer's.
Okay.
Yeah, so he's losing his mind, and one of the things about the Green Martians is that they have telepathic abilities, psychic abilities, and so his dad's mind is sort of wigging out, and it's causing people to go insane on Earth, and so they have to do this whole story that's an allegory for taking your dad's keys away when he has dementia, but it's putting a mental clamp on Martian Manhunter's dad so his psychic energies don't go out too far. And I'm near the end of the season, and now they're at the part where he and his dad are doing a sacred Martian ritual involving the Staff of Ra, or whatever they call it. That's the thing from Raiders of the Lost Ark, but something like that. Sure. And it's where the father transfers all his memories to the son. And it is one of the most emotionally fucking affecting things I've ever seen. This whole season-long arc of Martian Manhunter watching his dad's mind degenerate and then finally taking on all his memories. It's crazy. It shouldn't work. It's totally one of those Buffy the Vampire Slayer things where they would take a very real, hard to talk about issue in the world and just put a vampire's face on it, and then they could make it work in a fantasy setting. But I just think it's amazing. There is a TV show that aired last year that for a full season had an arc about Martian Manhunter dealing with his father's Martian Alzheimer's, and it was actually really good, and that's crazy to me.
Yeah, that does sound very good. And it is another one of those moments where you have to stop and think about how strange the breadth of the DC live action offerings are. That is
yes.
You have what sounds like this really beautiful, earnest use of the superhero sort of thing in the Martian Manhunter character to do this emotional Alzheimer's sort of parable almost. And then on the other side you have fuck Batman. And that's such a huge gap between those two things. I don't know how DC's going to reckon with that shit.
They're not. Their plan is throw shit at the wall to see what sticks. But yes, it's it's so clearly one hand is not talking to the other. At some point, they're launching this DC streaming service. are the CW shows going to be on that service? And if so, could you just like surf from, Martian Manhunter and his dad, like, bonding over this like Martian chess game they play to like make sure the father's mind is okay, to fuck Batman, I'm going to go masturbate on a criminal or something. Like, what is this shit?
Yeah, no, it's weird, but I'm glad that there's good stuff being done with those characters in live action, even if it's, even if I guess you have to kind of take the bad with the good in this instance.
Yes, I love Supergirl the show, but I do especially love the Martian Manhunter character is great. David Harewood is such a good actor, and he gets so much good stuff to play in this part. It's so silly, and he embraces it so thoroughly, and it's just, it really makes me want like a cool, good Martian Manhunter movie where you would have the effects to like do more with the character, obviously, and really let him be a superhero. But I just can't believe they made a Justice League movie, and they had fucking Cyborg when they could have had fucking Martian Manhunter. Exact same amount of special effects. Martian Manhunter is actually probably easier to do because you don't have to mix a human face with like alien. You could also just have a dude in makeup. That's possible too. I don't get it.
Yeah, no, it's weird. It's disconcerting. But again, at least Martian Manhunter is getting some screen time. He's getting out there in the public consciousness. There are people right now that did not know who Martian Manhunter was and then watched the Supergirl show, and now they love Martian Manhunter. And that's a plus. That's a good thing in the world.
Absolutely. It's not something anybody expected when Supergirl was announced as a TV show, that it would become the prime 21st century beacon for Martian Manhunter fandom, but it has happened.
Yep. It's where we're at.
All right. Sean, do you have a stuff to tell us about?
I've got a couple pieces of stuff. Obviously, the main thing I've been doing is I have been desperately throwing myself at Yakuza Kiwami 2 in a desperate bid to finish that game before Spider-Man comes out in, 5 days. Oh, God. I really have 4 days. I really have 4 days to finish Yakuza Kiwami 2. And Yakuza Kiwami 2 is really fucking good. I don't even know how much to talk about it because, I've obviously been on my Yakuza kick since I played Yakuza 0 a year and a half ago, because that was January 2017, and then I've had that this kind of steady drip of Yakuza since then that will hopefully keep on going, because whenever they come out with the up-resed PS4 versions of 3 through 5. But yeah, for the people who don't know what Yakuza Kiwami 2 is, it is a remake of Yakuza 2 in using the Yakuza 6 engine, so it's a full PS4 game. It's not like the first Yakuza Kiwami, which was a remake of Yakuza 1. That was basically just Yakuza 0 with the Yakuza 1 story kind of put in it. Yakuza Kiwami 2 uses all the Yakuza 6 stuff, so it's much more updated from the last thing I played, because Yakuza 0 and Kiwami were basically just PS3 games that were put on the PS4. This is a PS4 game from the ground up, and there are little things like that normally you don't think about because we've been living with these consoles for so long. That's just oh man, you almost never run into a fucking loading screen in Yakuza Kiwami 2 because you just have so much more memory in the console now. So in Yakuza 0 and Kiwami 1, it was all, whenever you would have to go into a building or just a convenience store and you wanted to buy some healing items or something like that, all of those were behind loading screens. In Kiwami 2, it's all that is completely seamless. You can just walk from the street into the store. You can, when you're fighting people on the streets, you can bring them into the stores and the fucking shelves explode and you can throw them into the countertops and stuff. So there's something about that with Kiwami 2 that's a lot of fun if you've only played 0 and Kiwami 1. It's really cool to have this full step up and be oh shit, it's actually a next gen game. You've got, really nice graphics. The cities, Sotenbori, which is an Osaka city, and Kamurocho, which is the main Tokyo city that all the Yakuza games visit. Both of those locations look so gorgeous now, and there's a lot of good neon lights, a lot of good puddles on the ground that look like the neon reflecting off of them, nice rain-swept city streets, and all of that stuff, that sort of technological upgrade is a lot of fun. But obviously the core of the game and the core of Yakuza and the thing I'm enjoying the most is, of course, the story and the weird sort of side content stuff. And the story in Yakuza Kiwami 2 is really interesting because you kind of have... It's interesting for me of now having to this more direct sequel, because obviously Yakuza 0 is this prequel that was made after 5 of the games were made, so it's kind of separate. Yakuza Kiwami is... the original Yakuza game, which was made in like 2004, so the original story skeleton of that is super old, and they just kind of tried to pile stuff on top of it to connect it to Zero and make it feel a little bit more modern. And Kiwami 2 feels more like this is a like sequel to that story, and I kind of feel more like I obviously don't know what Yakuza 2, the original Yakuza 2 was like that much, but this feels less like they have had to sort of add stuff onto it like with Kiwami 1 to modernize it, and it feels more like the original structure of that story was modern enough that they didn't need to flesh it out that much. Because from what I understand from the Yakuza community, Yakuza 2 is held in really high regard, and playing this game I really understand why, because you have this really interesting sort of core storyline relating to this Yakuza conflict between the Tojo clan, which is your guys who Kiryu, the main character, is kind of joined up with, and then the Omi Alliance, which are the main Yakuza group in Kansai, in Osaka, so that's why you go to Sotenbori, the Osakan city, in this game as well. And there's this nice feud that is building up between Kiryu, who's the Dragon of Dojima from the Tojo clan, and you have this other guy, Goda Ryuji, who is the Dragon of Kansai. And so they're kind of, set up as these opposing forces in the East versus the West. And there's a cut scene in the first 2 or 3 hours when they meet for the first time, when Kiryu visits Osaka, and they just kind of encounter each other in a cabaret club. And there's this really nice, just super tense, them kind of like verbal jousting, trying to figure out how much do you know about me? Are you who I think you are? And like, how do we navigate this really tense situation because this war is about to break out between these two Yakuza clans? And it's just like this 15-minute Yakuza short film set in this like little interesting cabaret bar. And it is so tense and so interesting and so cool. And so all that kind of nice, juicy, good Yakuza story stuff is here, manifold in this game. The character models are also excellent, and one of the things I love about these Yakuza games is the faces of the characters, even on the PS3 versions, and with what they could do with the PS3, the faces are so interesting because they model them off of the actors, and you have so many of these great, just sort of like grizzled old Japanese men with these really interesting faces, and there's a couple of these characters, like one named Kawada, who's a police chief, who just has such a compelling, interesting kind of charismatic face with all these lines and kind of experience and age on it. And it's the kind of thing that in video games you just tend not to see characters that have that quality to them. Most characters in video game models, like if you think of, even really good character models like Joel from The Last of Us or Nathan Drake from Uncharted, they have a certain sort of like pseudo-generic Hollywood movie guy kind of look to them, and a lot of the characters in Yakuza don't have that. They have this like Takeshi Kitano sort of thing of like, this is a fucking dude. This is some dude that they modeled that has lived a fucking hard life and been through some shit, and there's something really intimidating and compelling about that, and it's something of these Yakuza games I love so much, and the jump to the next generation just highlights it even more, that even if their like technology and stuff is obviously not as good as Naughty Dog's, like what they're trying to capture is so much more personally interesting to me that it just hits me in the gut whenever you have these cutscenes with these characters that really go for it. It's great. Yakuza's great. Yakuza Kiwami 2 is amazing. I love all the story stuff, and the combat system is really interesting because they've kind of shifted it for Yakuza 6, and all that stuff's a lot of fun. And then maybe my secret favorite part of it so far, the thing I spent basically all of my Yakuza time today playing, was they updated the cabaret minigame from Yakuza 0, where you run a cabaret club and hire different women around the city to work as hostesses, and you have this whole rivalry with the other clubs in the city, and you like slowly build yourself up and level up your hostesses and play this minigame. It's a really great minigame. They have taken that from Yakuza 0 and basically made a sequel to that minigame in Yakuza Kiwami 2, because in Yakuza 0, you also go to Sotenbori, so you go back to that location in Kiwami 2. In Yakuza 0, it was when you were playing as Majima. Now you're playing as Kiryu, the other playable character. And it just, when you first encounter it, I was so overjoyed that they 100% get like kind of how to nail the fan service, because it's not just like an updated version of that minigame. The whole story told around the minigame is a sequel to the story from Yakuza 0, which took place in the 80s. So you have all the characters from that story, and you revisit them like 20 or 30 years later, and it's like Yuki, who is sort of your main hostess character in Yakuza 0, is now running this new club, and the old club that you ran before that like took over the Osaka nightlife scene has now been overrun by this like megalomaniacal like corporate douchebag, and Yuki and like all your kind of grassroots buddies got pushed out of the corporation, and now you have to build up again from the ground up and knock them down. And that was such a treat to see that, because that minigame was one of my favorite parts of Yakuza 0, and it was so awesome to see them take that shit and update it and bring it forward and tell a like sequel story to that in Kiwami 2. It's really cool.
Nice. Yeah, like I've said before, I'm excited for in a year or two when they have the giant box set of Yakuza 0 through 6, and you just buy the whole fucking thing for $150 or whatever it'll be, and then you have 700 hours of Yakuza to play.
Yeah, it's a lot. One thing I am a little bit heartened by is it does seem like, so far it feels like this game is more Yakuza Kiwami length than Yakuza 0 length, because Yakuza 0 was like a 100-hour game for me. Yakuza Kiwami was like a 40-hour game, and I think this is more in that 40 to 50-hour mark, so I think I can do it. I think if I kill myself, I'll be able to finish it by Spider-Man.
Well, good luck. I'm not doing anything intelligent with this either, Sean, because I'm buying Dragon Quest XI on Tuesday.
Well, there you go.
I'm not finishing that by Friday. I think that would be literally mathematically impossible. If I were just playing, if I just skipped school and just did Dragon Quest XI every hour between the Tuesday when it comes out and 3 days later when Spider-Man comes out, I probably still wouldn't beat it. So I'm just going to have it on the side. But the Dragon Quest XI reviews came out, and there's no way I'm missing that. So yeah, I'm going to pick that up too.
Cool.
Yeah. And I'll let you know if you should kill yourself by playing it.
I will definitely get around to Dragon Quest XI at some point, but I don't think I can fit it in. I don't think I can live that life right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to play around with it for a little bit, focus on Spider-Man. But the nice thing is, for the rest of September, there's nothing major coming out I was planning on playing. And October, there's a lot, but I'm probably going to just save myself for Red Dead, and that's near the end of the month. So I should have plenty of time to play these. Asterisk, we shall see.
Yes, that's a good plan. If only Yakuza Kiwami 2 came out a couple of weeks after Spider-Man, and then my life would have been so much easier.
Yes, well, we'll see how it all goes. Let's go up to the next thing on my stuff list, so again, we're going up the ladder in Spider-Man 2 adjacents. And the next thing is, I don't know if I've ever admitted this on the podcast, I have never seen the original Evil Dead movies.
Oh.
Yeah, and I should have. I would have admitted this when the remake came out, because we talked about that, and the whole thing was you had seen all of them, and this was my first Evil Dead movie.
That's true. Yeah, I think that was basically. I think we talked about it then.
Yeah, and I'm a big Sam Raimi fan from his non-Evil Dead work, which is not a usual thing people say. I think people are usually Sam Raimi fans for Evil Dead first, and I was like, we're doing this series on Spider-Man. I'm going to finally watch these fucking movies. They had a Blu-ray set of 1 and 2 on Amazon for $7. So if you want good Blu-rays of Evil Dead 1 and 2, that's a very cheap way to do it. And I have not had time to watch the second one yet, but I did watch the first Evil Dead. That movie is fucking crazy.
Yeah, right?
Holy... I was on the fence, because I was like... Before I watched it, I've seen the remake, which is the bloodiest, goriest thing I've ever seen. It's, Evil Dead 1 is from 1983. It's pretty old at this point. Horror does not always, age the best, especially if it relies on, any kind of graphic imagery. So it's is this going to scare and shock me? It did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Evil Dead 1 is fucking crazy.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I think... The whole Evil Dead series has the reputation of being very, comedic and campy in a good way. People love it for that. But that's not Evil Dead 1. Evil Dead 1 has a couple of little moments of levity, but really, for the most part, that's not it. Bruce Campbell is not Bruce Campbell yet. He is a dude who they basically turn into silly putty in this movie by just throwing gallons of fake blood on him. And what I was so impressed with about the original Evil Dead is... they made this movie for, $90,000, probably less than that, out in the woods. They just found a cabin. They didn't build it. They just found a cabin. Raimi and the actors and the crew, which was very small, just stayed in that cabin for like 3 weeks shooting the movie. They all got like really sick because they had no form of heating. They burned most of the furniture in the cabin to heat themselves at night. They would be like, "Are we using this furniture in the shoot tomorrow?" "No." "All right, that's the one we're burning tonight." And yet, the movie comes out so well. It is such an artistic statement of talent and of vision, especially the last half hour when it really goes off the rails and you're really just down to Ash and all the Deadites around him, and there is just the most gnarly, gory shit going on in every corner. There's that scene with like all the stop motion effects of the bodies melting into like maggots in front of him. It is unbelievable to see, and my favorite sequence in the movie doesn't even have any of that in it. There's a sequence where Ash has locked everyone out, and he realizes he has to go downstairs to get batteries for something. And he goes down there, and it's like a good 10 minutes where Bruce Campbell is the only actor on screen. Nothing overtly scary is happening to him, but the blood starts like coursing through the house, and then like the pipes in the house fill with blood, and he just gets drenched in it. And then there's the thing where the movie projector turns on, and he like is splattered with blood from that. And just the amount of like funhouse horror, haunted house like craziness that Sam Raimi and friends put into that movie is like truly like almost like humbling to watch. As like, what did you do by the age of 22, you fucking bum? That's what that movie makes you feel like, because it is like such a statement of talent. It's also a gorgeous movie to look at, like not in that like gorgeous things are happening in it, but it was shot on 16mm film. For its vintage, it's actually been really well kept up. Like the restoration on the Blu-ray looks really, really nice. It looks like a very nice 16mm print. It is so well shot. It is so well framed. I was like constantly taking note of compositions that kind of blew me away. And yeah, this isn't even like the Evil Dead movie that has the biggest cult following, because that's probably the sequels. But I was like, yeah, I'm glad to see more of Sam Raimi's craft, because it definitely informs some of the stuff in Spider-Man 2. You watch that scene in the hospital with Doc Ock, and you're like, oh, this is a walk in the park for him. Like, this is reflex for this guy, because he, like, invented so much of the language of modern, like, 80s on horror for the United States. It's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad that you really enjoyed Evil Dead 1, because that's one that I think some people, I feel like if you, going back to it now, it can be a bit divisive. I think everybody loves Evil Dead 2. People who know what they are love Army of Darkness. But obviously, Army of Darkness is a very weird, like, different kind of comedy movie. Evil Dead 1, I've definitely felt like some people love it. Some people, I don't think anybody hates it, but some people just don't react that well to it. I've always really liked Evil Dead 1, so it's cool that you're way into it, too. And one of the things that is, like, hearing you talk about it and thinking about the Spider-Man stuff, one of the things that's interesting that I hadn't quite thought about, that the qualities of Sam Raimi directing those movies that made him so good for directing Spider-Man, is that I think your reflex would be that, oh, this guy who's mostly made these like really cheap budget kind of horror movies, how is he ever going to handle like the budget and like the technical scope of a huge studio movie like Spider-Man? But it makes you realize, like, no, those movies are so effects heavy. There's so much ingenuity and like cleverness in how you craft the effects and shoot the effects in those films, that the only difference is like a problem of scale. And so having him have that experience of making these super effects heavy movies with the Evil Dead stuff makes it so that when he gets to Spider-Man, some of the stuff he does with how he shoots with the effects in Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3 was so ahead of its time and so interesting. Like, you look at how he handles Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2 and the sort of like effects realization of that and his role as a director and getting that across on screen and how you do that. His, like, Evil Dead and making those movies is exactly the kind of experience a director would need to set them up for that.
Yes, and here's something I noticed watching Spider-Man 2 today, is so much of how he shoots the actual, like, Spider-Man web-slinging action of him swinging through the city and stuff, which I've always found just, like, hypnotic to watch. He really makes you feel like you are there swinging with Spider-Man. You feel the momentum of it. It's it's a beautiful realization of that character's powers. And one of the key techniques he uses there is POV shots. Like, he does a lot of, we're not even going to have effects in this shot, we're just going to have the camera swinging up a building or through the streets or something, and that's going to make you feel like Spider-Man. Well, you know where he pioneered that? That's The Evil Dead. That is all over that movie, is creepy POV shots. Because that's how he, like, conveys, especially in the first half of Evil Dead, before anyone has turned Evil Dead, is all these, like, POV shots of whatever that weird force is. It's even how the movie ends, the like, crazy tracking shot into Bruce Campbell's face as he screams, and then we cut to credits. So, yeah, it's not like a coincidence that this guy did both of these.
Yeah, no. I'm glad you're watching Evil Dead. I'm very excited to hear you talk about Evil Dead 2, because I think Evil Dead 2 is probably my favorite of the three movies. That movie's fucking... You think Evil Dead 1 has some nuts shit in it. Evil Dead 2 is amazing.
Yeah, I'm excited to see it. It's I'm definitely like... I was thinking of watching it today as like a double feature with Spider-Man 2, and I was like, it's probably too much for one day, because those are probably, for a lot of people, Sam Raimi's like two best movies. So
yeah, no one man can take all that Raimi.
No. All right. My last piece of stuff, climbing up the Spider-Man ladder, is Sean, like a month and a half ago on this podcast, you talked about, but like before I moved to Iowa, that you discovered while reading Spider-Man comics that there was an amazing Spider-Man concept album in the 1970s, and you shared it with me, and my life has changed. It's amazing. Do you want to recap for the people what this album is?
Yes, so in the mid-1970s, a couple of years, I think it was 1974, because it was a couple of years after Gwen Stacy died, which is very important if you're listening to the album, the context of when this takes place in Spider-Man's history. Stan Lee and the others at Marvel Comics got together and made an album with, obviously, some outside artists called Rock Reflections of a Superhero, with the cover art done by John Romita Sr., who's a great old Spider-Man artist, and it's really good cover art of 70s-ass Peter Parker standing in his apartment with his hands folded behind his back, looking into a mirror, and Spider-Man looks back at him out from the mirror. And yeah, they made a full concept album that has, 7 or 8 different tracks on it of songs, and in between each song, there is narration performed by Stan Lee. And the story of the concept album basically takes you from the kind of like the beginning of Spider-Man and Peter Parker getting bitten and becoming Spider-Man, and then through him meeting Gwen Stacy, and then the album ends with Gwen Stacy having been killed and Spider-Man having to reconcile that with his life. And it's a very dark note for the album to end on, of just like... the last bit of narration that Stan Lee does is really good, and just talking about it, it's like he has to live with this tragedy because he is Spider-Man. But yeah, they just fucking made this album, this concept album. They put it out, and then the most amazing part of it all is that they did a CD remaster in the early 2000s, and so this is not something that is like impossible to find, like I initially thought it was when I saw the ad in a reproduction of the 1970s fucking comic it was in. It is straight up, you can just get it on iTunes, you can get it on Amazon Music, you can order a physical CD if you want to, you can just get this album and listen to it, and I highly recommend you do, because it is so fucking amazing.
It's not just a, like, cool curio from the 1970s of, like, listen to how crazy this fucking Spider-Man concept album is. I want to stress, it's a good album. Like, that's maybe the craziest thing about it, because you said 7 or 8 songs. There are 11 full tracks on this song. Yes, I counted it up just now. And they're all good. I liked every one of them. And some of them I think are kind of legitimately amazing in different ways. Like, my favorite song on the album might be the song New Point of View, which is Spider-Man just singing about how cool it is to, like, web through New York. And I'm like, I really hope the Insomniac game just fucking plays this while you're running around New York, swebbing your way around, because it's really cool. That one's good. There's the song Peter Stays and Spider-Man Goes that's early on, where Peter is, like, reflecting on his dual identity, and it's actually a really good piece of lyrical writing about, like, the core identity dynamics of the Spider-Man mythos. The song called Spider-Man is very good. There's the song Gwendolyn that's a 50s doo-wop that I cannot get out of my goddamn head. That's pretty good. And then the last song, Time Will Show Me the Way, that's like Peter thinking about, like, his life after Gwen. It is a very dark note to end on, but also very good. It's a good album. It's a fun listen. It's only like 45 minutes because, it's from the 70s and was on vinyl, so it would have been shorter. The Stan Lee narration in between is sublime. The writing is just, it's so Stan Lee, and he gives it the most Stan Lee delivery, and I love it. It's so good. And if you're wondering what the music has been for our podcast intros the last couple of weeks and will be for the next couple of weeks, yeah, it's from this album.
Yes. So if you've been enjoying those intros, you want to hear the rest of those songs, this is where you can do it. Another song of I think I'm with you, Jonathan. My favorite song is New Point of View. Another song that I love just for the deliciously dark fucking irony of it is the song Count on Me, which comes in the story after he meets Gwendolyn. So it's after Gwendolyn. And then it's kind of the song about him trying to him and Gwen kind of try to get together. And the song is him saying you can count on me. I will be there for you. And it's no, Peter, you can't fucking count on you. This is what Spider-Man 2 is about. Dude, you got a complicated life. You need to get your priorities straight. And no, she cannot count on you because she's going to get fucking killed by Green Goblin at the end.
Yeah, it's not a happy album in the end, but it's so great. I'm baffled they made an actual Spider-Man Broadway musical and didn't use this music. That should be a fucking crime against humanity. You would replace that with Bono. I mean, who gives a shit about Bono? I want this fucking mid-70s people I've never heard of singing about Spider-Man. It's the good shit.
Yeah, one of my favorite things also about the album is I feel like every single song you can feel oh, this is basically a Pink Floyd song. This is basically The Who song. This is Jefferson Airplanes. It's there's such a clear one-to-one influence with a number of the different songs with the hottest artists of the day. And that's a very fun game to play, to be what is the album that they listened to right before they made this? It's oh, it was probably that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's our music shout-out of the week. Again, we've shouted it out before, but now I've heard it too. I'd heard it a couple weeks ago because I downloaded it the night you told me about that on the podcast, but then I was out of commission for a while and we had pre-recorded stuff coming out, so we're only getting around to talking about it now. But yeah, we will certainly mention it more in the Spider-Man-filled weeks to come.
Yes. On that note, us talking about that album just reminded me, Jonathan, of another piece of stuff that comes from the interim. Because the other thing we talked about a month and a half ago or however long it was on the episode right before you left was I gave you this Spider-Man album as a present. And then you gave to me as a present the filmography of the Chinese director King Hu.
Oh my god. We might need to just make this a separate episode because, Sean, I'm so in it. Sean, I've been doing interlibrary loans. I'm showing it you right now, where I've found other libraries that the University of Iowa interacts with, where I can get his other films that are not easy to get. So this one is a fucking bootleg. This is a bootleg of his film, The Valiant Ones, but a library had it. It's so bootlegged that it is an old VHS rip of the film with Japanese hard burned in subtitles and then English subtitles burned in above that. I'm going somewhere with King Hu, Sean. I've got books all around me.
It's good because he's a fucking director to go places with. Because, it's been a while since I watched the movies. Because I think I watched them basically the week after you started your trip to Iowa. And I've only watched the 3 that you talked about so far. I keep on meaning to get around to Come Drink With Me at some point. Because that's the other one that's pretty easy to get access to. But I watched Dragon Inn, A Touch of Zen, and Legend of the Mountain. And you were 100% right, Jonathan. Legend of the Mountain is my favorite one. That movie is fucking just made for me. It is, as you described then, it is basically Chinese wuxia gothic. And that's a fucking combination of some shit. But the King Hu's movies are amazing. He has such an interesting sense and a different sense of how to make a wuxia movie than most other wuxia movies I've seen. Because it's not a genre I have a tremendous love for. I've seen some that I like Hero obviously is a big touchstone for people. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon is a movie I like, but I tend to go more for the traditional Hong Kong kung fu stuff over the wuxia stuff, which is a bit more stylized. But yeah, the way he does the action feels more like a mix between wuxia and Kurosawa, and that's a fucking thing I can get behind.
it's so Sean, I have not just been this is the thing I've been forgetting to talk about on the podcast for 2 weeks. I have been on a Chinese film kick because of King Hu. I've watched all the movies you've seen again. I got to Iowa and I watched them all again because I had to put them in boxes, and then I was sad for like the week they were in boxes, and I got them out again and watched them. I've seen some other of his stuff. I saw Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon for the first time, which is not as good as its reputation, but it's an interesting movie. I watched the entire Zhang Yimou wuxia trilogy, which is Hero, House of Flying Daggers, and Curse of the Golden Flower, and you should see all those movies, and I think Hero is one of the best films of the 21st century.
Yeah, there's some good early Donnie Yen at the beginning of Hero that I love.
Oh my God, he's good in that. Yeah, but everyone is. Hero is amazing. I've backed up and seen some other Chinese wuxia, their early like 60s, 70s King Hu era stuff. I'm now going in other directions, and I just watched Jackie Chan's Police Story for the first time.
Fucking yeah!
That we're gonna get off track, but the last 20 minutes of Police Story might be the craziest action adjacent thing I've ever seen. But getting back to King Hu, yeah, I love these movies to death, Sean. I think you're so right. He helped invent the modern wuxia genre. Like him and a guy named Cheng Che, I think is his name, who did like the One-Armed Swordsman, are kind of two different people working in the 60s and 70s who are really influential to it. But like everyone today references King Hu, and I think it's because the key innovation he brought in is the Kurosawa element and the overall just the samurai movie thing. Like I've been watching all these bonus features and reading about him, and in particular, you'll like this, Sean, Zatoichi movies were huge in Hong Kong and Taiwan at the time.
Oh, yeah. Fucking Dragon Inn, that is a Zatoichi movie. That is a Zatoichi movie without Zatoichi in it. It is so, like beat for beat, that is a fucking Zatoichi film.
Yeah, and so those were huge influences. And then what he adds to it is a lot of Chinese culture, because he's really interested in, I think, different kinds of Chinese spirituality and architecture and history. Like his knowledge of the Ming Dynasty was really deep. But also, he made it, the fight scenes are more dance than they are fighting. Like they are based a lot on like Beijing ballet stuff, or Beijing opera, which is kind of a form of ballet. And so it's this incredible mix of on-screen choreography, editing, cinematography. I think King Hu is the most audacious editor since Sergei Eisenstein. Like, literally, and that's the kind of thing that if I said that in, like, class the next couple of days, someone would, like, throw something at me, but I think it's true. And it's, yeah, I can't even talk about it coherently. I'm thinking about what I'm going to do with King Hu, because I'm going to do something with all of this. You know, I have, like, dissertation decisions to make soon, and I think he is a fascinating filmmaker. My favorite of the three is probably A Touch of Zen, but I also think, like, Dragon Inn, I could watch 3 times a day. It's just a perfect goddamn movie. And Legend of the Mountain, I could not watch 3 times a day because it's 3.5 hours long, but I would try, because I want to get that insanity in my fucking veins.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you turned me on to that, because I've sort of went away from the wuxia genre for a long time. One thing, like thinking about this, one movie recommendation I would like to make to you, Jonathan, it's not wuxia, it is Hong Kong action, but like kind of talking about some of these movies has reminded me of this film. SPL, Sha Po Lang, is a movie from 2006. It's an earlier kind of Donnie Yen movie, directed by Wilson Yip, they are like the pair that they also made all the Ip Man movies. And SPL, it's also known as Killzone over here. It is basically, the best way I can describe it, and the way to describe it to you, Jonathan, to get you to watch the movie, it is basically, what if you made a Hong Kong kung fu action movie and a Takeshi Kitano Yakuza movie and put them together? And that's basically what SPL is. It's so fucking good. You have to watch that one.
Well, guys, we'll see you next week. We'll talk about Spider-Man 2 another time. I'm going to go watch that does make me very excited. Sean, I've got a whole list. I've been renting a bunch out of the library, both our local Iowa City Public Library, which has an unbelievably good collection of Chinese films for a public library, for any library really, and our school library, which is big, and then using this interlibrary loan stuff. I've just got a fucking list. The Ip Man movies are luckily on Netflix, so I've got those in my queue. Chinese cinema is fascinating. It's a really rich cinema that operates in interesting fits and starts because of social changes. Go Google China if you want to learn about that.
Yeah, Chinese history, yeah.
Yes, it's complicated, but it is such a fascinating cinema. It's a combination of cinemas because it's really 3 or 4 cinemas working together. But yeah, that sounds awesome. Donnie Yen is because Donnie Yen starts appearing in a lot of those early 2000s movies, and he's so exciting to watch because it's like before he's a star, but he is like a scene stealer, you know?
Yeah, he definitely has that presence. Like the minute he steps on screen, it's like that dude's fucking going somewhere.
You should definitely watch Come Drink With Me. It is also amazing. There has always been a legend that... So there's a group of kids in that movie that the male lead, leads around and they, sing songs with him. There is a legend that one of those kids is Jackie Chan as a child. It's unconfirmable. Jackie Chan has said that's him. Researchers have, cast doubt on whether that even could be him. But I just love the idea that he was there for, the birth of wuxia as a film genre. Because that's kind of what Come Drink With Me is. It's anyway. We could and should at some point just do a whole podcast on this for super nerds, but yeah, I'm into it right now, as you can hear.
Awesome, yeah. I'm glad that you have found that love, and your love for it has reignited my old love for it. That I haven't gone to Chinese films in a while, and so it was fun to revisit that.
Yeah. Oh, another thing, Sean. While we're on it, Legend of the Mountain, which you said you loved. How about those drum-based action sequences?
Mm-hmm. Oh, fucking yeah. Because I think that's for me the thing with King Hu is that because wuxia is typically so such a super stylized sort of subcategory of action, and I feel like the wuxia movies I've watched that I don't really do it for me are in this weird middle space, and King Hu is either something like Dragon Inn, which is a bit more grounded, or Legend of the Mountain is what if we took the fucking stylized shit in wuxia and pushed it to 11, because that is what those drum scenes are in Legend of the Mountain. Is we're just fucking going all the way with it. We're totally disconnected from any sense of reality at that point. That's what I can get into.
Well, because there's the first one that happens about an hour into the movie where this lama, not the animal, the Buddhist monk, is outside the compound, and he is drumming on this thing to try to keep the evil ghost spirit out, and then the evil ghost spirit is in the compound drumming. And this is what I mean when I call King Hu the best editor since Sergei Eisenstein, is the intercutting there and the way it uses, they are not at all together. And yet it creates this, they are fighting, and they are not in the same physical plane. I've never seen anything like that. That is masterful editing and choreography. And here's the thing, Sean. In the original cut of that movie that came out in theaters, that movie was originally cut down to 110 minutes by its Hong Kong and Taiwanese distributors. What we have now is a restored print that gives it back to King Hu's director's cut, which is 3.5 hours, or 3 hours 15. All that stuff was cut. You can find the original 2-hour, not the original, but the cut down 2-hour version on YouTube. It's a terrible print, but you can see, and they just allied all of that stuff. They cut out all the good stuff, basically.
Huh.
And that's why that movie was just ignored upon release, basically, because it was cut to ribbons. It wasn't promoted well. Wuxia was already kind of on its way out in favor of kung fu movies. And luckily, this one print of the film survived, and that's what they used to restore it for this Blu-ray that you and I have presumably seen. So, yeah.
Yes,
we're very lucky to have it.
Yeah, because the quality of the restoration is immaculate. It's a gorgeous-looking movie.
Yeah. We're lucky to have all of them. I hope they do more, because some of these, like I said, my little interlibrary loan of the Valiant ones, it's basically a VHS, which is better than nothing, but, not much at a certain point. All right, we're way off track. Let's move on. We're going to do the news real quick, guys, because there's not a lot, and there's just some things I want to joke about here. Let's see. First off, Sean, they announced Streets of Rage 4 this week.
Right, yeah, that was a weird announcement. That just came out of nowhere.
It did. It's being developed by Dotemu and Lizard Cube, who were the developers behind last year's Wonder Boy the Dragon Trap, which is that beautiful remake of the Sega Mega Drive game, or Master System game, Wonder Boy 3. And that's the one where they did it all with hand-drawn visuals. But this is a new game ground up. It's Streets of Rage 4. I have to tell you, Sean, if you said, pick a 16-bit game that's going to get a sequel, I would not have guessed Streets of Rage 4. But it would have been on my personal list, because I am a closet Streets of Rage fan.
It's a really good series, you know.
It's
like those brawler games from that era tend not to hold up that well to me. But yeah, Streets of Rage of those games is among the best. Streets of Rage 2 in particular.
Yes, I actually went back and replayed Streets of Rage 2 this week because I have it on 3DS. There's this company that went and did a bunch of Genesis games on 3DS, and they rebuilt the games from the ground up and made them in 3D. They are the original pixel art. They look very accurate, but they have really good dimensionality. Sonic 1 and 2 were done this way as well. And for Streets of Rage, it's actually really helpful because Streets of Rage, you move on multiple planes. And I had a blast going through it. It's mindless, but it's very fun in a very arcadey way. And I actually think this is a cool way to bring it back because it sounds like it's pretty faithful to like the core mechanics, but it is a new art style, looks really gorgeous, seems like it could be fun.
One thing, they need to get Yuzo Koshiro to do the music. Like, the music is Streets of Rage to me. Like Streets of Rage 2 is like among the best video game soundtracks, particularly from that era. And I hope if they can't get him, like, keep it stylistically similar to that. And I wanted to have the fucking Genesis grime on the sound. I want that fucking just Genesis dirty fucking music in me.
Oh yeah, like when I play Streets of Rage, it's that music more than anything. It's like it's a hit. It's just right there in the pleasure centers of your brain is what that music is. It's crazy. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But all right, so that's happening. I wanted to mention this because I love this game. Shovel Knight just announced its final expansions, King of Cards and Shovel Knight Showdown, which is like Shovel Knight Smash Brothers, although Shovel Knight is going to be in Smash Brothers as an assist trophy because everyone is. And that's launching in April alongside a physical version of the game. I just wanted to mention this because I'm a big fan of Shovel Knight, and I also had to go back and look and be like, how long have they been making this game? Shovel Knight launched in 2014, and they're going to be putting out their final expansion for the game in 2019. And the reason they're still doing it is because they had all these Kickstarter stretch goals back in the day when Shovel Knight was a Kickstarter game, and this is the final stretch goals. So this is like the opposite of every Kickstarter ever. Not only have they fulfilled their end of the bargain, they went to like hell and back to do it. They're like, it takes us 5 fucking years. We're making that fucking King Knight DLC, and we're not just like half-assing it either. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Kickstarter and the crowdfunding thing has been such a like weird mixed bag for video games. But yeah, Shovel Knight is probably the best example of it.
Because, like, I mean, one, it became a success on its own terms, which bodes well for that, but also, like, they have not ripped off their fans. They did not, like, rip off the Kickstarter people. They had to wait a while for all of this, but they're also making really good games out of it. And it's a great series. And you only have to buy it once, and then they give you all the DLC. Like, it's free. If you already own the game, they're not going to charge you again for it, which I think is cool. I love that series, and people should just play it. It's Spectre of Torment, which was last year's DLC. Very nearly got on my top 10 last year. But then last year became 2017.
Yeah.
So, yeah, good stuff. Let's see, what else we got here? I'm just trying to make fun of the Venom movie at every chance I get at this point because it looks so amazingly horrible. Mm-hmm. But this week's thing that makes it easy to make fun of is it has been announced that it will have a theme song from the new Eminem album. 1, didn't know Eminem was still around. 2, there is probably no way to make your movie seem more late 90s, early 2000s outdated than choosing an Eminem theme song. I don't know who at Sony decided, like, you know what the kids love? They loved those old shitty superhero movies, all the ones that weren't Spider-Man 1 and 2. Let's make it look as much like those as we can. The kids loved Fantastic Four and Catwoman. Let's do it. Like,
Venom almost feels like at this point, it might as well be set in fucking, like, 2005. Because it just feels like it's a fucking period piece. It feels like it's like, yeah, like, it's like Daredevil. It feels like it's from that weird little period, like the, like, fucking 5 Punisher movies or whatever they made. They made a bunch of those movies, fucking the first Ghost Rider movie, like all of those from that weird little period. Whereas like Sam Raimi was over there like knocking out of the park. X-Men 2 was good, and everything else was kind of shit. And then obviously then you had Batman coming up. And this just feels like it's in that weird little like grimy sphere, and you don't understand who they're making the movie for. It's just looks incredibly unpleasant, and then Eminem is involved for some reason.
Yeah, I don't get it. I am not going to see this movie. I'm looking forward to reading the Wikipedia summary and making fun of it live on the air. But, I'm prejudging the shit out of this movie. I don't care. It looks as bad as a movie can get.
Yep.
One might even say Suicide Squad-esque.
Jonathan.
That's my punching bag now. All right.
Don't forget Suicide Squad won an Academy Award. That's an Academy Award-winning film. Okay?
Spider-Man 2 also won an Academy Award. Learned this today. I
forgot.
It won visual effects that year. So that's cool.
Well deserved.
Yes. All right. Let's see. Xbox. This is an interesting piece of news. Xbox and Microsoft have announced an Xbox All Access plan. This is a new way to buy an Xbox where you can do it if you have good credit. I think they do a credit check. Basically as a zero-interest financing option. So you could buy an Xbox One S for $22 a month or an X for $35 a month. And that cost also includes Xbox Live Gold and Xbox Games Pass. It's a 2-year financing thing. This is very similar to what a lot of people are doing with cell phones now. So, for instance, Apple, that's actually how I have my iPhone 7, is like you pay a certain amount a month for your iPhone, although they don't bundle in some of this other stuff, so that's interesting. No one's ever done this with a console before, to my knowledge, but it is an interesting step. It is also one of those things that just feels like Xbox screaming in the back of the room, please, God, notice us.
Yeah, it's interesting because this was, I remember around the turn of this console generation, so in like 2012, 2013-ish, there were a bunch of rumors that this was what Microsoft was going to do back then for what we would come to learn was the Xbox One. And then that never came to pass. They did charge $500 for it, but they didn't give a subsidy option. And so it's interesting to me that like this is when it actually comes up, and when they actually do it is near the end-ish of the Xbox One life cycle. I'm curious if this is going to be a program that they continue for whatever the next Xbox 2 or whatever the fuck is going to be. I wonder if they're going to like expand that option for that in the future. But it's an interesting step. Like it seems like it's a pretty decent deal. It does not seem like they're like gouging you if you go for the subsidy thing, which is a risk for those kinds of plans. So yeah, I think it's cool and interesting that Microsoft is doing that, and I'm curious to see how it works out. I'm curious to see if this is successful for them.
They're not gouging you, especially on the Xbox One S model of the plan. You're actually getting fairly significant savings if you add it all up. Now, you are being sold Live Gold and Xbox Games Pass, which you might not use, so that is tied in there as well. I would note that like financial planners would tell you not to finance something like this that is so purely a luxury item, that this is... Like, it's, $20 a month is not much, but if you worry at any point in 2 years you could be in any kind of financial trouble, you don't want your fucking Xbox to be the thing that's, carrying you down on that. So I would note that. It is interesting. It's one of those things, like, Xbox has been doing desperately trying to do all these different, innovations, for lack of a better term, over the last couple of years. Some, I think, are going to stick and influence other parts of the industry. Some are not. I can't imagine a Sony or a Nintendo doing anything like this, because if people are already buying your thing, you just don't need to do this, because consoles are expensive, but they're not iPhones. They're not the kind of thing that you generally would need to finance that much. It does point to me, though, to... They're clearly seeing the future of Xbox as a service and subscription model, they would really like to be the Netflix of gaming. I think the terms Netflix and gaming don't really go together, because that's not how people play games. So I don't think that's going to take off in the near future. But yeah, I don't know. I did boot up my Xbox for the first time in Iowa today because I wanted to see the changes to the Master Chief Collection. I don't know if you heard, but they completely redid it, and the patch for the Master Chief Collection was 73 gigabytes. Mm-hmm. I did not have 73 gigabytes free, so I just deleted the Master Chief Collection and reinstalled it, because what it was is it's the entire game was redone. That's what the 73 gig patch is. They literally gets rid of the entire existing code and redoes it. And I was kind of excited to try out the multiplayer that they had revamped and stuff, and I went in and tried it, and then it said, you can't play online. You don't have Xbox Live Gold, and I turned it off, and I don't know when I'm going to turn my Xbox on again, because that's the world. Yeah.
There you go. Welcome to the Nintendo Switch in like a month.
Yes. All right. So I had one other thing on here, but I think we're going to skip that for this week. Sean, you want to talk about Spider-Man 2?
When are we not talking about Spider-Man 2, Jonathan?
Not today. Today we're talking about Spider-Man 2. Yes. So
yeah.
if you've never seen Spider-Man 2, 1, spoilers from here on out. 2, go see Spider-Man 2. It's really good. Highly recommend it. Watch Spider-Man 1 first if you haven't seen that one. Don't be cynical like all the fucking dude bros online who don't like these movies. Just watch them, love them, embrace them, and then come back and listen to us nerd out over this greatest of superhero movies.
Yes.
So, Sean, I watched this movie today. I took a lot of notes on it because I couldn't help myself. It's so good. I had so many thoughts. Because I had watched the film about a year ago for Homecoming when that came out, I decided this time, for the first time since I think the year 2007, I watched the Spider-Man 2.1 version, the extended cut.
Right, yes. I was going to ask which version you watched.
Yeah, I usually favor the theatrical cut. It is the better cut, and I'll talk a little bit throughout about what the extended cut changes, because it's definitely interesting if you're a fan of the film, because this is not like a director's cut. I don't know if Raimi was even involved. They just took a lot of like snippets and put them back in. But it is an interesting way to, like, 1, see more of a movie you might like, and 2, to I think about how movies are cut and like why less is often more. You know, it's not a crazy extended cut. It's like 10 minutes longer. But it is definitely, there's some interesting stuff in there, and one J. Jonah Jameson line that absolutely kills me, and we'll get to that. But that is the version I watched. Do you still rock the theatrical cut?
Yes. What I tend to do is I kind of switch off each time I watch the movie, because I watch it with a relative enough frequency that I'm like, this time I'm going to watch the theatrical. I agree with you. I think the theatrical version is absolutely definitive version and the version that people should watch. But the Spider-Man 2.1 cut is interesting, and there's I feel like there's a Spider-Man 2.05 cut that exists that would be because there's a couple of little bits of scenes that are extended in the 2.1 version that I like a lot. There's a little bit of stuff with when Peter and Doc Ock have their dinner conversation. There's just a couple of lines here and there and that kind of stuff that I miss when I watch the theatrical version that kind of stick out to me that they're not there. But the 2.1 cut is so top heavy, and the beginning of the movie is so long in that version, because I feel like that's where the most of the additions are, that it just takes such a long time for the movie to get going that theatrical is definitely the one to go for, and so I watched it for this one.
Yeah, there's also just a lot of little things where a scene has the right balance, and they add in an extra line to a joke, or they keep going with a dialogue exchange, or in one case, the longest addition actually comes in the middle of the movie when Peter is contemplating not being Spider-Man anymore, I think, and you have an extra scene where Mary Jane is talking to one of her girlfriends about whether or not she actually likes her fiancé, and then an extra scene with Doc Ock, and in the theatrical cut, it's 2 scenes with Peter side by side, and you just go on his emotional journey. That's really, I think, necessary in the theatrical cut, not to interrupt that flow. So there's things like that. But yeah, it makes the first act, which this movie's first act, I think, is fairly long to begin with. Not in a bad way. It's just there's a lot there. It makes it top heavy, but it's interesting. I like that it's just included on the Blu-ray, so you can just choose it if you want and compare the two. Yeah. All right, but let's get to the main event, Sean. We like to call Spider-Man 2 the best superhero film of all time. Why is that?
Because it's the best. One, again, we said this, or I said this at the top of the show, but it just goes reiterating: Spider-Man is the best superhero, just objectively, scientifically speaking. Spider-Man is the best superhero. Spider-Man 2 is the best superhero, or the best Spider-Man movie of a surprisingly large number of Spider-Man movies that exist when you really think about it, because there's 6 of them now. And so it's the best Spider-Man movie. Spider-Man is the best superhero. Therefore, Spider-Man 2 must be, through math, the best superhero movie. But if you really want to dig into it a little bit more, it has all the stuff of the great balance of tone that Spider-Man one has. It has the good kind of corny, cheesy superhero stuff. It is very funny when it wants to be funny. It's got more J. Jonah Jameson in it than Spider-Man 1, which is good. And fucking every single J. Jonah Jameson scene makes me laugh out loud in this movie. Even when he's only in a shot in the scene, it makes me laugh every single time because it's so funny. So all that stuff is great. The action is really well done. Not to say that it's not like, when we were talking about like Donnie Yen, it's not that kind of action, but like kind of the set pieces, like the train scene at the end of the movie obviously is pretty famous for good reason. It is such a master of building up tension and releasing the tension. And so all that stuff and all that sort of like technical filmmaking, narrative development stuff is so excellent in this film. But the core of what makes it the best is the character work, and the way that Sam Raimi dives into the essence of Peter Parker in Spider-Man as a character, the dynamic that makes Spider-Man work as a superhero, which is that he kind of doesn't want to be a superhero, and he's kind of bad at being a superhero, because being a superhero and living a normal life is basically impossible to do. And so it's such a great way and a great vector to sort of get into that question of like, what does it mean to be a superhero, and more essentially, what does it mean to try to do the right thing and try to be a good person? And that is the like moral question at the heart of Spider-Man 2, and it is kind of the moral question at the heart of what is a superhero and why should a superhero exist. It's also like the moral question that is at the heart of like literature going back hundreds, thousands of years. What struck me about watching the movie this time is it has a lot of similarities to a genre of literature from the sort of like Middle Ages called morality plays. That, not to say that it's strictly a morality play, but it has that kind of quality to it, of it digging into this like moral question and using all these characters as different lenses, like Dr. Octopus and Aunt May, kind of like the two clearest lenses of what does it mean to be good and how are you a good person. And Spider-Man 2 asks that question and explores that question with such an insightful humanity, and it's such a like ear for humanity, and the pacing and the acting and the editing and the cinematography and all of that is aimed at exploring that central core question about that character and about us. And I think that is what makes the movie so striking and so powerful to me every time I watch it, is it really digs into the heart of these like really basic fundamental questions about morality that has plagued like humanity and has been asked in art for literally like as old as art is. And Spider-Man 2 just fucking does it.
I agree with all of that. That's where I was going to go with this. I think with the possible exception of the first two Chris Nolan Batman movies, Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, which are some of the only other superhero films I would put up in the same tier with Spider-Man 2, unless we just consider Spider-Man 2 as its own tier, so maybe the tier beneath that is where I would put those. With the possible exception of those, I don't think any other superhero or comic book movie has anywhere near this depth of engagement with the basic idea of what it means to be a hero. What does it mean to actively make the choice to say, I have an ability, I have a power, and I'm going to use it to help people? And I think part of that is because that's a question we sort of take for granted. Superheroes save people, Superman, there's a little bit of this in Superman 2, but it's more, do I want to bone Lois Lane, do I not? In that movie, frankly. But Superman gets to Earth and he has powers, and Marlon Brando tells him to save people, and he saves people. And there's nothing wrong with that as a structure, but, that's what he does. Iron Man has maybe a little bit of that in the first movie, but for the most part, once Tony Stark has locked into his choice, he is Iron Man, he's going to go save the day. In all of the MCU movies, it's really more of a taken-for-granted thing than I think it is an active exploration thing. And again, that's fine, that's the genre, it's one of the key pieces of buy-in, but I do think Spider-Man 2, crucially, just takes a step back and asks, why is it important that Peter makes this choice? Why is it important that it is a choice in the first place? What does it mean to have that choice, to be able to look at the world and say, I could go this route, I could go this route, and then to make the decision to go down one or the other? And I think the movie follows through on that in every fiber of its being. This is one of those movies that is so thematically on point, it's kind of mind-boggling. Every scene, every character, every piece of the overall narrative structure all comes out of this central thematic question about what it means to have great power and to have great responsibility. You start the movie with an opening that shows Spider-Man trying to deliver the pizzas, trying to go to class, trying to work with J. Jonah Jameson, trying to meet his relatives. And through all of that, it's about that balance. And it throws us right into that main thematic question. And from there, you get to meet, Otto Octavius, who is this sort of mirror of Peter Parker, who has his own thoughts on responsibility. He becomes a villain who embodies that same idea that Spider-Man is dealing with, which is power and responsibility. And every step of the movie throughout mirrors that. Like, this is a movie that is very teachable, I think, especially in the narrative sense of internal versus external conflict, because Peter's internal conflict drives the movie more than anything else, should I be Spider-Man or not, but the external conflict of Doc Ock is such a perfect accompaniment to that story that you never feel the movie is overstuffed, or that when we get to Doc Ock we're going away from like the psychodrama that frankly takes up a lot of the film. It is just all on point. And the last thing to me that, I should say, we should talk about this more later. Spider-Man 2 is also just a deeply personal film, I know, for both of us.
Right.
For me, it was the first movie I officially reviewed as a film critic. I was 12. I had just been named the movie kid, I think was the title, for the Colorado Kids at the Denver Post. That was the position. But I was doing the movie reviews now, and Spider-Man 2 was the first one I went to. I remember that screening vividly. I remember where I sat. I remember the weird people who were sitting around us. I remember that they handed us out comic books, and I can remember like what was in that comic book, like as like the little souvenir they gave us. I remember what the screen looked like. I remember what that theater felt like. It was so vivid. The movie imprinted on me, and one of the things it imprinted was, oh, this movie has action, and it has thrills, and it is exciting, and the action is very well done when it comes. But that's not what this movie is interested in. This is not an action movie in the sense of we're going to have big, bombastic displays of action. It's not even a superhero movie in that sense. It is a movie that is not about heroism as big, bombastic displays of heroism. It is a movie about heroism as deep internal contemplation of heroism. So you have long stretches of this film where he's not suiting up, where nothing is going down in terms of action, where it is just Peter Parker going about his daily life and contemplating things. Even when they do have big action sequences, the contemplation winds up being more important. So, for instance, at the end of the big train sequence at the end, it's a really well-done action sequence. And you could break it down technically, I think it's immaculate. But what you walk away with from that scene is when it ends, the people on the train pick up Peter, they bring him to the back, they give him his mask, and they say, "Don't worry, you were not going to reveal your identity," and then they stand up for him. It is always the moments in between the action and the moments that affect people that make this movie special. And I think this movie is more willing to slow down and think about things than most summer blockbusters. It's not an Andrei Tarkovsky film. I'm not saying that. It's not like a weird essay film. But it is, I think, pretty shockingly human at its heart. And I'm always struck by that because I think it's still ahead of its time on that count, if not several others as well.
Yeah, I agree with you with all that, Jonathan. I also think that in the classes you're TAing, you should introduce yourself as Jonathan Lack, movie kid. It's like, hi, I'm Jonathan Lack, movie kid.
It made more sense when I was 12.
But it's a great title. It's just you should get a business card. It's perfect.
I should have my own superhero suit. MK on the front.
Yes. Jonathan Lack, the movie kid. But yeah, for me, the sort of the personal connection to Spider-Man 2 is more from the lens of like the Spider-Man side of it, obviously, because this movie came out in 2004. So I had already been reading Spider-Man comics pretty heavily by that point. But there was something about Spider-Man 2, and I mean, it still holds true about this film now, is it is such a... I think it is maybe like the most perfect encapsulation of the Spider-Man character and like the core of the character in one contained thing. Obviously, there's a lot of comic book stuff out there. I'm reading a lot of it now. I'm like at like 250 or something of Amazing Spider-Man. God, there's a lot of those comic books. And a lot of them are great. But it's obviously an ongoing thing, and it's kind of hard for any one issue or one storyline in those old comic books to kind of capture the essence of the character, because they're still really building the essence of the character even at where I'm at. And Spider-Man 2 just has that benefit of something like Batman the Animated Series or the Arkham games that we've seen with some of those other characters, of being able to look back at the entire history of this character and kind of pick and choose what are the things that work the best? What are the things like with like Dr. Octopus that we need to change to make him a movie villain? Because they basically redo Dr. Octopus. His character has, in terms of like the essence of like the human Otto Octavius part, has very little direct relationship to the comic book character, who's a more kind of stock, just like evil scientist guy, kind of just like stock mad scientist character that has a very cool evil superpower. But yeah, they kind of take that stuff and refigure it and re-examine it with a new lens and kind of just like put together all this different kind of stuff from the period when Peter Parker is in college, from the kind of like early 70s Spider-Man comics, from the age of rock reflections of a superhero. And it is so impressive to me, and it was kind of mind-blowing to me then watching Spider-Man 2 to just see this other kind of take on the character that is definitely recognizably different from what is the core sort of like mainline Marvel Comics continuity version of Spider-Man, but that digs into the essence of the character in a way that kind of illuminated sides of it that I don't think I had ever really sort of verbalized to myself. And obviously I would have recognized it subconsciously because it is what the character is, but it's that tragedy of being a good person that is the kind of the heart of Peter Parker, that he is this human that is like fundamentally a good person. But because people are flawed, being a good person hurts because he makes mistakes, and he is good enough to recognize those mistakes and reflect on those mistakes and feel pain about the pain that he's caused other people and about the mistakes that he's made in his life. And there's something so powerful to me from like a narrative perspective on that component of being a tragic hero, not in the sort of Aristotelian sense of like you are the hero of a tragedy that has a tragic fall like Hamlet, but of being a hero like a Superman-esque hero character, and being somebody like that is in of itself tragic and has a tragic quality to it, because living that kind of life is inherently painful for the person that has to live it, and they have to sacrifice so much to live that life, and everybody else benefits from it. And Spider-Man 2 digs into that tragedy, but then comes out with like, but of course this is who we need to be. This is the kind of person we need to strive to be, and it is incredibly painful to be that person, but it is what you need to be a good person, to be human, to be in society, and to help people, and to live a life that's worth living. It is that essence. And again, like it's this sort of core universal thing that is explored in a lot of different media and a lot of different art across all of human history. But Spider-Man 2, by tackling it especially through this character that I've always loved ever since I was a kid, it really sort of like shined a spotlight on that aspect of the character that has affected me my whole life. And I like kind of think of it as part of like a fundamental building block to me being who I am today, is having those experiences with this character, and Spider-Man 2 exploring it like that.
It's so true. If someone came up to us and asked, I've heard of this Spider-Man guy, but I don't really know what he's about. What's Spider-Man about? I'd say go watch Spider-Man 2. And you will come out of Spider-Man 2 and you will know all you need to know. Will you get every piece of all possible Spider-Man mythos? No. Sam Raimi never had much use for like the quippy side of Spider-Man. That's not really in there. There's plenty of villains that you're not going to meet. There's plenty of side characters. There's all sorts of eras of Spider-Man that are not encapsulated. But if you want to know the single animating thing, thematic idea that makes Spider-Man a great character through all incarnations, and will continue to be a great character through all incarnations, Spider-Man 2 encapsulates it as well as I think any single thing possibly could, which is that with great power comes great responsibility, and that's tough. Responsibility is really tough. It is not easy to have responsibilities and live up to those. It's not easy to live up to yourself or to other people, but it is worth it. It is worth the struggle and worth the challenge. And I think that is what Spider-Man 2 ultimately does. It is a sad movie at times. It's a movie that I think, and it's always had somewhat of, not a mixed reception. It was very well received at the time. But I do think in like larger fandom, some people love it. I don't think anyone hates it, but some people are kind of dismissive of it because it is so not a traditional superhero movie in a lot of ways. As we said before, it's not bombastic. It's fairly quiet a lot of the time, actually. But I think that's the key. It asks things of you, and then it is ultimately so affirmative. It is, and it builds to its affirmations I think, in such beautiful ways. It shows, not tells. You know, telling is Uncle Ben sitting Peter down and saying, with great power comes great responsibility. Showing is watching Peter struggle with his dual existence, choose to get rid of his Spider-Man persona, live without it for a little bit, and realize how hard it is to see bad things happen in the world and know you could affect them and not take a stand, and then realize why he needs to take that stand. And I was going to save this for the end, but I actually think it's worth mentioning here while we're on the topic. I think part of why Spider-Man 3 is such a problematic movie, and we'll get to it next week, is not just because of the studio interference and, oh, they added Venom and it's too overstuffed, and all those things we know about Spider-Man 3. I think part of it is just, Sean, if I asked you to write a sequel to Spider-Man 2, would you know what to do? Like,
no, God, no.
It is the Spider-Man movie. It is everything I think you could want to thematically do with this character is done in Spider-Man 2, and at the end of this film, I don't know what the next story is. It's the exact same problem that something like The Last Jedi has run into, I think. That's not a problem with the movie The Last Jedi. It's because the movie is great, but I don't envy anyone having to make a Star Wars movie after that. It's the same thing I think The Dark Knight fell into conflict with, is that The Dark Knight said, I think, everything Chris Nolan had to say about Batman, and so The Dark Knight Rises is a very odd retread in a lot of ways. Godfather 2, like the granddaddy of all movie sequels, there's no reason to make a Godfather 3 because you said it all. Like, yes, the characters are still alive and they're still going to do more things, but I think that's the thing. Like, Spider-Man 2, they left it all on the field. And when you feel a movie go out there and make that effort and just leave it all on the field, it is incredible, but it's also not something that is easy to make a sequel to, you know? Spider-Man 2 is not franchise-minded in the way a lot of superhero movies are. It leaves the thing open that Harry Osborn is going to become the Hobgoblin, but other than that, like, I really, at the end of this movie, and I bet Sam Raimi would have said, if you sat him down now and said, like, what was your idea for Spider-Man 3 at the end of Spider-Man 2? And he would say, my idea was to go on vacation, you know? Like, I made the fucking movie. Where do we want to go next? I think those are a lot of the long introduction to this conversation. Let's start with that just amazing opening sequence.
Oh, yeah, the opening credits?
Well, oh, God, I forgot about that. I was going to talk about the pizza scene, but the opening credits, Sean, why are those so great?
It's just like that, when you were talking about watching Spider-Man 2 in the theater and remembering where you were, that's like the opening credits are the moment in that where I'm like, fucking man, like I feel like I'm back in that theater seat, because it is this beautiful opening credits sequence with these gorgeous artistic like recreations of the scenes as paintings from the first movie, and it really strikes you how iconic and interesting a lot of the visual imagery was from the first film, that you just get to have these like still images going through as the opening credits play, and you get the, you know, that great Spider-Man theme playing, and you just get to see little snapshots of, I think my favorite one is the one of Spider-Man in the wrestling ring hanging up on the side with fucking the Bonesaw looking up at him. There's something really great about that shot to me. But yeah, it's this perfect, wordless, beautiful recap of the first film. Obviously not something that I feel like if you hadn't watched the first film, I don't know if that would necessarily fill you in a lot on what happened. But if you watched the first film and then hadn't seen it again until Spider-Man 2 came out a couple of years later, it is this perfect way to just be like, oh, right, okay, that's who Spider-Man is, that's who Harry is, that's Mary Jane, that's J. Jonah Jameson, this is like the arc of what happened over the first movie, now I'm ready to go.
Yes. It's a great opening credits sequence. I think opening credits sequences in movies are a lost art. You just don't get them much anymore. And when you do, like, either they just throw the fucking opening titles on just the action as the movie starts, which that always feels like boring to me. That's what TV has to do because they have limited time. Like, make it stylish. And so, like, other than, like, James Bond movies, which have carried that torch for 50 years, you don't get many interesting opening credits sequences. This one is so great. The paintings are amazing. Just the way it recaps that first movie. The Danny Elfman music is so good. And of the many disappointments of Spider-Man 3, they didn't do a cool opening credits sequence, and I think that's one of the bigger ones for me.
Yeah.
Because I wanted the cool painting recap version of Spider-Man 2, and we never got it. That's a crime.
It's true. But so that's the opening credits. What about the pizza scene do you love, Jonathan?
Everything. It is such a great opening. Like, it is, one, it just operates on the level that a sequel needs to, and that it is a fun reintroduction into this world. Like, how do we reintroduce the two, sides of Peter Parker and Spider-Man? We have to get them both back into the movie. We want to show off Spider-Man's powers. We want to be an energetic, like, get you into the film. But it also, and it accomplishes all of that, because it's a very fun, kinetic sequence. It's got, no, it's not. It's Asif Mandvi from The Daily Show.
Yes, he's playing the guy who runs Joe's Pizza.
Yeah, Mr. Aziz. I almost called him Aziz Ansari, who he is very much not, but his name is Mr. Aziz, and it messed me up. But no, Asif Mandvi, who's very fun in that sequence. And Emily Deschanel also is in this as the receptionist. Just continuing, Sam Raimi has this crazy sense of who to cast. Like, he casts people right before they become stars. Bones ran for like 45 seasons, so I think this was right before Bones started. But anyway, so you have all of the fun stuff in this sequence, but also just as a thematic introduction, like, tell us what the movie is going to be about, like, lay out the thesis. It is Peter Parker cannot get anywhere on time. He is trying his hardest, and the more effort he seems to expend, the more he seems to fail. And I just think a lot of the times when I watch movies, I'm watching them with this critical lens of, like, how are they making this movie and what makes it work? And I am in awe of how economical. I use that word a lot with, like, the origin story in Spider-Man 1, but I am so in awe of the economy of just the opening of this movie in terms of telling us what the movie is going to be about, stylistically, thematically, and otherwise. It's really well done on that level.
Yes, I 100% agree. It is the perfect little entry. There's a great, just the series of different gags. My favorite gag in the opening is the dude who gets the pizza boxes and is about to eat the slice, and Spider-Man webs it away. It's just, like, so perfectly timed in how that's built up and paid off. But yeah, it is also the introduction to what is, like, the first half, maybe 2/3 of this movie, which is Peter Parker just getting shit on constantly. Every single scene. Shit on. Nothing ever works for Peter for, like, the entire first half of the movie until he decides to give up Spider-Man. Everything fucks up. He fucks up, and the world around him fucks up in such a way that he gets fucked over even more. And it just strikes me every single time that this movie just immediately opens with him losing his job. It's like, that's the first thing that happens in your superhero movie to your title character, to Spider-Man. Like, imagine if fucking Superman opened with Superman losing his job at the fucking Daily Globe, right? Or the Daily Planet. Like, that would, it's such a different kind of thing, but it's so Spider-Man of, nope, this is where he's at. He's at fucking rock bottom. Not only did he lose his job was fucking delivering pizza on a dumb little scooter, and he couldn't even keep that job. That's who our superhero is.
Yes, it is. It's great on that level. It does that hard cut where Asif Mandvi says you're fired, and then you get J. Jonah going, you're fired! And you have him getting fake fired from the not the Daily Planet, the Daily Bugle.
Yeah.
Which
there's a lot of fake comic book newspaper companies around.
Yes. And there's a lot of fake J. Jonah Jameson firing Peter in this movie. That scene also just has this great little human moment where Peter has gotten unfired. He gave them the picture of Spider-Man. Jonah agrees to give him $300, and he goes out to Betty Brant and says, oh, here's my check. And she says, I don't think this covers your last advance. And you realize that, like, oh, God, he's barely scraping by. But then in the middle of that, Elizabeth Banks does this beautiful little chin-up. And, like, just there's so many little grace notes of humanity in this movie. We'll talk about this later more, but, like, as much as I love the films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and have enjoyed, like, watching them and talking with you on them about this podcast, rewatching Spider-Man 1 and 2 reminded me of how little I think they generally have those little grace notes of humanity. And, like, Guardians of the Galaxy does. Depends on the movie, but, like, it's unique amongst these films. But I'm getting off topic, because yes, Peter Parker gets shit on all over this movie. The other Spider-Man 2 movie, Amazing Spider-Man 2, you remember that one, Sean? It's horrible.
That fucking movie.
Came out 10 years almost to the day from real Spider-Man 2 and fake Spider-Man 2. And fake Spider-Man 2, do you remember how that movie opens, Sean?
Dimly.
Okay, that movie opens with him also chasing down some bad guys, but in this one, he's chasing down the bad guys. He wins. He has no trouble. He gets all of them. He captures Rhino. Everything's fine. He saves the day. He gets to his graduation. this might be an exaggeration, but in my memory, this is what happens. Andrew Garfield skateboards on stage, high-fives everyone on stage, gets his diploma, and then kisses Gwen Stacy, and everything's perfect, and he's everywhere on time. Like, if you want a starkness of, like, somebody getting Spider-Man right, it's Spider-Man 2, he can't even keep the pizza job. If you want them getting it wrong, it's Amazing Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man has no problems in the world. He's perfect, and he's a superhero. He is a superhero in both. But he's like, a superhero in the shitty one.
You also just reminded me that Paul fucking Giamatti is in Amazing Spider-Man 2 right now. I had totally forgotten that until you mentioned the opening of that movie. It's like, fuck it, that's right. He's in the beginning, get into those movies. But yes, you're 100% right that Amazing Spider-Man 2 is, as always, the starkest example you could have for getting, a superhero movie wrong, but specifically a Spider-Man movie wrong. And that, in actual real Spider-Man 2, he loses his pizza job, and then he manages to get some money from the Daily Bugle, and you immediately realize that, he kind of got money from the Daily Bugle, but no money that he can actually use right now, because it just has to go off to paying his advance. Amazing Spider-Man 2 just is obsessed with Spider-Man being this super cool, hip, witty dude who makes all the fun jokes and is super smart and all that. Whereas, that's fine maybe for a comic book series to do a little bit of that kind of Spider-Man, but for a movie and for the heart of the character, you need to just have Peter Parker fuck up and get shit on constantly. One little thing before we move on from this scene that I do want to touch on that I love, again, kind of like what you're talking about with Betty Brant, of these little extra touches that they do, is I love the portfolio that Peter gives to Jameson of his photography of that he wants to sell, which are all these really beautiful black and white shots of these two old men playing chess in the park and somebody on a pier with doves flying away. And it's just these beautiful shots, and it gives you this little glimpse of Peter is someone who takes photography seriously. He was at the photography club in high school. It is a serious hobby for him, and he's stuck taking these fucking bullshit shots of him being Spider-Man with this remote camera that is also morally dubious whether or not he should be able to sell those to the Daily Bugle, considering that he is in and of himself Spider-Man. But yeah, he's stuck just taking all these action shots of Spider-Man, and he wants to have all these artsy, really nice, beautiful photos, and Jameson wants nothing to do with it.
Speaking of Jonah, he has a great line in every scene he appears in. The one in this is they're trying to figure out what goes on page 1, and he says, okay, picture this. We're going to have get a dirty-looking chicken and say, food poisoning scares city. And then the dude comes in and says, the food is poison? And he says, yeah, I feel a little queasy.
Yeah.
I love that one. He's just so funny.
The dialogue in the performance from J.K. Simmons is so fast and furious in this movie that it is something of where, I feel like the first probably 5 or so times I watched this film, there were a bunch of jokes that J. Jonah Jameson says that I didn't quite catch because it's so quick. And now that I've seen this movie, God knows how many times, it's I have half of his dialogue memorized, so I know all the jokes. And it's fucking yes, it's the fucking it's the headline about the food illness going around. It's I'm feeling a little nauseous. Yeah,
it's great. All right, we get a really nice scene where Peter goes home and there's a surprise party for him at Aunt May's house. I wanted to talk about this scene because this is where you re-meet Aunt May, Harry, and Mary Jane, and there's some nice interactions between all of them. You see Aunt May is on hard times because the world doesn't just shits on all the Parkers. May Parker gets shit on a lot too, sadly.
Ben Parker's fucking dead, so maybe he's the one that got shat on the most.
Yeah, that's true. Ben Parker was the guy who did the right thing, and he just got fucking gunned down for it. So, yeah, there's a curse on this entire family. But, yeah, you see May is losing her home. Let's talk for a second. There's a lot of great scenes with her. Rosemary Harris in this movie is one of the best performances in a superhero movie. True or false?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's because it is the kind of role that normally would be so cliche and kind of one note, but her performance and the script gives her all these extra little moments, and there's such a range of emotions that Aunt May gets to express in this film, from the normal sort of doting, loving, caring, wise mentor figure that she normally gets to be, but then also she gets to be angry and upset and disappointed and kind of a little bit sort of like cute with the interactions at the bank and stuff like that. And yeah, her whole range of humanity that you get to see from Aunt May, she's such a fully realized character in this movie. And she was more so than you would expect in the first movie as well. But in this one, I feel like they really dig into her being a person alongside the other characters, not just this sort of stock one-note mentor figure. Yeah,
she's so good. And she also gets to kick ass in this movie a little bit in the bank sequence because she knocks the shit out of Doc Ock.
Yeah, that's like such a good shot when she just fucking beams him in the fucking side of the head with her umbrella. So good.
And then Spidey has the line, he goes, "We really showed him, didn't we?" And she goes, "What do you mean, we?" And he goes, "Oh," and then flies away. I've always loved that little moment.
Yeah, really good.
It's good. But yes, Rosemary Harris, there's a key scene with her later that I'm sure we'll get to because she gets to deliver the moral of the movie, and she does it beautifully, and she is still alive and kicking. Rosemary Harris is 90 this year, and she's still out there, and she is awesome, and I just never going to be a better Aunt May. She's so good. Perfect. But we also get to re-encounter James Franco and Kirsten Dunst here. Let's talk about Harry Osborn just while we're at this spot, because there's not much he's not a big part of this movie. I think James Franco is better in this film. He's more confident. He feels more fully formed as an actor. And I do think he has some very good moments of just being rich guy petty, like when in all the scenes with him and Octo Octavius where he's like just reminding him how much he pays the bills. That's all very good, just being a petty rich snob. But for the most part, his arc in this is that he doesn't like Spider-Man. He thinks Spidey killed his dad. I don't think any of his scenes are bad, and in fact, I think there's a lot of good ones in terms of how they reflect on Peter, and they use that very well, that he's alienated from his ostensible best friend. But I do think, it is the part of the movie where they're most wheel-spinning because they don't resolve Harry's arc in this movie. This is all prelude to the next one.
Yeah, it is definitely, it feels like, while, James Franco does a very good job at being a smarmy asshole, which is very much the Harry Osborn role in this movie, I agree that it is, I don't think it's necessarily an issue with this film.
No, I don't.
Because it's like, it is such a sort of like tertiary element to the film, but it does feel like that is the one side of the film that they are holding off for a sequel. That's like, we'll do the Harry Osborn shit later. Right now, he's just this like kind of convenient plot device to work on the Otto Octavius side of the story. He's a convenient plot device. I agree with you that he has some good character stuff to work with Peter, and the way that Peter having to lie about his identity hurts the people around him, the people that he's supposed to help. And the fact that he cannot help Harry, and that Harry is so heavily distressed both from the death of his father and then everything that's happening at Oscorp, that's basically his fault, and Peter can't do anything to help him with any of that shit.
Yeah, I think, honestly, it works pretty well for most of the movie. If there's any scene where it feels distracting, it probably is the Willem Dafoe cameo at the end, just of, like, the literal to-be-continued scene of we're going to have more of this next time, is the only time where the movie feels like it's not leaving something on the field, But other than that, yeah, it's fine. I do want to talk about Kirsten Dunst because she is amazing in this movie. We said that about her in the first movie. I think she's very good. I think she's especially good in the sequel here. And that first scene she and Peter have where they're out back like they were when they were teenagers, and they're just talking again, and it's where you learn that she's engaged. And, Peter he's so on the fence of whether or not he feels like he should come clean with her. He doesn't know how to talk. That is one of those scenes that, watching it again today, I'm always blown away by it. It is such a quiet little scene between the two of them. There's so much that is unspoken. There is so much between the lines, between the performances. It's the kind of like very, very down-to-earth human acting that you don't usually get in a movie like this that tends to be more spectacle-driven.
Yeah, I agree. The Mary Jane side of this movie works for me a lot better than not to say that it doesn't work in the first one, but it's as we talked on last week's podcast, there's some stuff in there that feels like it's just kind of stuck in a little bit of cliche and a little bit of tropes around that kind of storyline. And here, there's just a lot more meat in the character relationship between MJ and Peter, partially because you already have like this foundation to build off of, but it's just the story between them is so much more complicated and interesting because it's that kind of thing of like they both know that they love each other. They both want to be together, but Peter's being Spider-Man is this sort of mysterious wall that she can't overcome, that she doesn't even know what that wall is or why it exists, and Peter can't tell her. And there's such an inherent, potent, dramatic tension and drama in that relationship, and in that dynamic that I think is so effective. And it is the kind of thing that I think helped bring to rise a different kind of Mary Jane in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics and in Spider-Man Loves Mary Jane, one of the best Spider-Man comics. And that whole romance dynamic and the way that Mary Jane is so human in that relationship is really effective to me. And I think Kirsten Dunst does an incredible job portraying that. And like you said, playing the role in a way that for superhero movies is usually more stylized and over the top, and here both her and Tobey Maguire have this much more, like, it feels like you're watching an indie rom-com when you're watching those scenes. Like, it feels like it's pulled from that tradition, and like a very good version of one of those, and that whole side of the movie works so well for me because of it.
Oh, absolutely. It's and it's not just that, you know, she gets to play that side of it well. I think they give Mary... I talked about this last time, that I think while Mary Jane exists in a... You know, definitely she's in the tradition of... she's there for the male main character. She is the romantic interest. Ultimately, Mary Jane's role in the movie is about her as an object of desire for the male main character. They do not upend this. But within that paradigm, I do think in both of these movies, they give her a hell of a lot more interiority and complexity than you tend to get with someone put in that sort of role. So, for instance, I think there's an amazing scene late in this movie where you have this sense throughout that Mary Jane and J. Jonah Jameson's son, what's his name, John Jameson?
John Jameson, yeah.
The
astronaut.
The astronaut. You get the sense that she's not really in love with him. He's a good guy. I like that the movie avoids the cliche that like he's not like a boorish bad boyfriend. He's a good dude. You know, you get no sense that he's anything other than a good guy who would make a good, you know, partner and husband. But she's not fully invested in him. She's not really in love with him. You get that sense. But the way they really show it is that scene where they're doing their wedding planning. She says, "Oh, lean your head back," and she kisses him, trying to recreate the Spider-Man kiss. And pretty much without dialogue, all through her acting, all through like the music and framing of that scene, they sort of reveal where her head is at, what she's thinking about, what she is and isn't getting out of this relationship. And also, they basically tell you there that she's essentially figured out Peter is Spider-Man, or she has like a strong suspicion of it, because that's a little undercurrent in the third act of this film. And I think there's moments like that where I do think this character feels three-dimensional on her own terms more than someone in this kind of Hollywood paradigm tends to feel. And I think that makes it, you know, work in this romantic structure more than it would otherwise, much more than it would otherwise.
I agree, and it's something of where usually the love interest character does not get to carry many, if any, scenes on their own, or carry the scenes that they are with whoever like the lead male character is. I feel like she has a number of different scenes that it's just her and it's not Peter. More if you watch the Spider-Man 2.1 cut. But then multiple scenes that she has with Peter, she is like the driving force in the scene, and it kind of feels like you see the movie both from Peter's point of view primarily, but you also get these glimpses of kind of seeing it from MJ's point of view. And from MJ's point of view, the story is so interesting of like, what the fuck is with Peter Parker? From her point of view, he's such a like flaky asshole who is constantly kind of stringing her along and is always kind of there making her like sure that she is aware that he loves her, but is never actually with her. And that like dynamic and being able to see it from her perspective is what to me makes that romance work so well and makes that side of the movie like very driving and powerful.
There is that. I mean, there's so many good duets between the two of them in this movie. There's the scene later on where he has stopped being Spider-Man and he goes to her play and watches The Importance of Being Earnest. I like all the glimpses of the play we get to see because it's basically like Kirsten Dunst playing herself, like being an actor on stage. Because what I love too is that like I think Marie Antoinette is 2 years after this, where she's playing like a, you know, person of nobility in another movie. So she was like doing these kinds of roles in other films at the time, which is sort of funny. But anyway, Peter goes and sees the play, And then they have this chat walking down the street, and he's kind of trying to reinitiate things. She is understandably wary, and there's so much good dialogue in that sequence. There's so much good back and forth. There's the whole... I've always loved Peter's line, "Punch me, I bleed." That's great. But also just her responses to this of like, you come see my play once and you expect things to start up again. I don't know where we're at. And the thing that kind of signifies this is him trying to get back to being this idealist he was as a teenager, where he has, says, "Oh, I imagined you getting married on a hill and you hadn't decided who you were going to marry yet." And that scene ends with this kind of withering look back from her saying, "I'm getting married in a church," and leaving. And it's like this gap between dreams and reality that they're sort of having to navigate together. And there's a lot of great moments like that. And it really helps having Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst here. These are two people who are fucking actors, and they are acting in this movie, and Sam Raimi is able to balance a lot of different tonal elements in this film, but I think he also is... Part of that is we focus so much on, like, the campy elements of the Spider-Man films, especially when people talk about them now, that, like, that's what Sam Raimi did. They were campy, and they used some of his horror stuff, and they do all of that. But I think part of the tonal variance of these movies is he also created spaces for his actors to just perform and live with these characters and be three-dimensional and down-to-earth and strip away anything that feels like artifice away from it. And I think that this movie can contain scenes like that where there is so little artifice, and scenes like Doc Ock and Spider-Man fighting outside of a bank and throwing coins at each other. You can do both of those, and it's amazing.
Yeah, it is always the range of being able to express all those different kinds of tones and mix them together is what can make a movie so rich. And whenever you have that situation of a movie deciding on a tone at the beginning and trying to stick to that tone all the way through, that tends to me to feel incredibly dull by the end. Whereas like Spider-Man 2 keeps you guessing, and it plays with so many different genres and so many different styles and tropes and references different kinds of movies, whether they be romances or whether they be monster films, and it has such a rich blend of all those different things.
Absolutely. It is such a deeply human movie. It strikes me every time, people talk about, like, The Dark Knight is like a super realistic movie. And in some ways it is, in terms of how it maybe portrays elements of its world. And I'm not saying this to shit on The Dark Knight. I'm just more shitting on the commentary around these movies. The Dark Knight is, like, Chris Nolan has a fairly theatrical sense of things. I do not get a sense watching his movies that his characters exist in the real world. And that's okay. I do not need that for movies. But there is no scene in The Dark Knight, or in Batman Begins for that matter, maybe a little bit more in Batman Begins, but mostly not, where like two characters sit down and talk about life and talk about their problems in a way that feels as raw and unvarnished as any of those scenes in this movie, whether it be between Peter and Mary Jane, or Peter and Aunt May, or Peter and that weird girl across the hall who is the daughter of his landlord, like the chocolate cake scene. No other superhero movie does those. Zero. Like, the closest you might come is something like Logan, that is super dark and has some very real shit in it about, dementia and alcoholism and all that sort of stuff. And even then, that movie operates on, I would say, a fairly more stylized plane. There are moments where Spider-Man, in both 1 and especially 2, where they just strip the stylism away entirely, and we're always coming back to this really human core. There's always been this, in the 2000s, I think, this want to, like, make the perfect deconstructionist superhero movie where it's like, what if superheroes were real? Like, people are always wanting to make that movie. There's like Kick-Ass sort of does that. James Gunn made a movie called Super. Watchmen in its own way is sort of this thing, although much savvier about it. But like, people are always coming out like, what if superheroes were real? Well, that's what Spider-Man is. That's what Spider-Man is. Spider-Man 2 is that movie because when you come back to Peter Parker at the end of the day sitting in his apartment, he feels like a real guy who's actually in a recognizable version of New York and dealing with, like, how do I pay the fucking rent? And then he goes out and is a superhero, and that makes it so relatable. And I know we're getting a little off where we started here, but that's why performances like Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst matter. It's why it matters that Mary Jane feels like not just an object of desire, but someone who is a person who exists whether or not Peter is looking at her. All of these things matter in building that air of reality, even if it's just emotional reality up. Yeah,
like you talking about the sort of the subversive thing made me think about it's something that I always tend to have this more of this love for whatever like the earnest thing is than the thing that is deliberately trying to be subversive. It's a trend in a lot of like the media that I prefer, because we talked about this I think with the video game stuff. With I like Ocarina of Time more than Majora's Mask. I like KOTOR 1 more than KOTOR 2. And another example that is just like that is people love to talk about Neon Genesis Evangelion as this like, it's so subversive, and it's like, what if giant robots were real? And it's like, that's what Mobile Suit Gundam was. Like, that's what, and that, I feel like that tends to, whenever people have this like subversive thing that's like, oh, this is so smart and subversive, and it's asking these questions about like reality and centered in reality, it tends to happen like decades after a thing already did that and you didn't realize it because it was just doing it earnestly. And it wasn't trying to be subversive. It was just what it was. And it was just pushing the genre forward, not trying to comment on the genre. And I feel like that's kind of like what Spider-Man was. It's just like, yes, there is a subversive element to Spider-Man in his day of like the reality of the character and being a superhero, but it never felt like it was deliberately trying to be subversive. Like, there's no gag about Superman in Amazing Fantasy 15. It's just telling its own story. And I feel like Spider-Man 2 does that as well. It's just, it is presenting a world where, like, what if just a normal person got superpowers? This is what their life is like, and it doesn't have to try to be clever about it. It doesn't have to try to be subversive. It just tells its story, picks that story, and goes with it, and it just earnestly is what it is.
Well, because what people are usually asking for is a meta-narrative. They're asking for, let's get meta with this, and we're in a very meta period right now. Like, that's what we do, is meta-narratives. And that's fine. There can be very interesting meta-narratives. Your favorite game of all time is Nier Automata. Nier Automata gets meta as shit. It just does it really fucking well. But Spider-Man 1 and 2, there's that one Superman joke in Spider-Man 1, but otherwise these are not meta movies. These are movies that exist within their own reality and are not thinking of the reality outside of that. And I think that's really important, because sometimes if you want to tell a good story, you just have to be in that story, and you don't have to be thinking about, and how does this comment on all the other stories? Because that winds up becoming, in some ways, an academic exercise more than a narrative exercise. And I'm not saying the two things can't coexist, but there's a reason why I think Spider-Man 2 has endured and, like, not just aged well, but in some ways gotten better with time. And that's because it wasn't thinking about its time as it's being made. And we're getting way off track here, but this is an interesting conversation to have about the film, yes.
Yeah.
All right. I don't remember where we were in the movie. Alfred motherfucking Molina.
Fuck yeah, Dr. Octopus.
So you mentioned this earlier. Doc Ock in this movie is not the Doc Ock of the comic books. Like, very interestingly so. Like, Green Goblin in Spider-Man 1, not exactly like other versions of Green Goblin, but he is recognizably that character. That is a pretty nutty character, and Willem Dafoe is a pretty nutty actor, so goes together. Alfred Molina is not the obvious choice, I think, in terms of casting for this character. This is not an obvious interpretation of this character, and yet nobody does not love Alfred Molina in this movie. Even if, like, this is not your favorite superhero movie, if I said, yeah, but what about Doc Ock? They'd be like, oh, yeah, he's one of the best superhero villains ever. Why is that, Sean?
Oh, man, there's so many reasons. Like, one is, because I think it is an easy thing to overlook, because you all obviously want to talk about, like, the humanity of the performance of Alfred Molina and how they sort of created this really interesting new dynamic for Doc Ock and Peter's relationship, and them being mere reflections of each other that is kind of elaborated on stuff that's sort of hinted at in the comics. And all that stuff is great, and it's obviously like the media stuff. But also, at its core, Doc Ock is just such a cool fucking idea for a supervillain. Like, every time I watch this movie, I can, or just read any issue, I think Doc Ock is my favorite Spider-Man villain. He's my favorite supervillain. And you can get into all the humanity stuff, because I also think he has an interesting character in the comic books. I don't want to be too dismissive. I think the Spider-Man 2 version is obviously, like, updated and modern, and, like, is thinking about how to create a more interesting character than, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko writing a one-off issue of Spider-Man number 3 when Doc Ock comes up. They had no idea if that character was going to recur. They had no idea if that was going to be successful. They just, like, had to make a new supervillain every single week. So obviously when you're making the movie in 2004, you have a lot more time to sit and see, like, how are we going to craft this character? But the original Doc Ock in the comics is a very interesting character, and from the human side of him as well. But it's just the fucking 4 mechanical arms are so goddamn cool, Jonathan. Like, it's just such a cool, different idea for a supervillain that is so physical to me, and I love that about him, that his powers are different. He's not just super strong, he's not just super fast, he doesn't have telepathy. It's not like the normal set of powers that any random villain has. Like Green Goblin has the most generic superpowers any villain could have. He's a little bit stronger, he's a little bit faster, he's kind of crazy, and he's got cool gadgets. That's like fucking 99% of every supervillain is basically just that. Doc Ock doesn't have that. Doc Ock just has these 4 giant mechanical arms grafted to his body that he can control with incredible precision that are incredibly powerful. And there's something so real and material and physical and about that ability that I just, like, you can feel it. You can feel the arms. You can feel, like, the weight of them and how they can throw people around, both in the comic books and then the way it's realized in this movie is so perfect and so incredible. And just the way he travels by, like, lifting up on his arms, and there's so many things you can do with the dynamic of those 4 big mechanical arms and be so creative, and you know, their powers with, like, really interesting restrictions, so you can't just do whatever you want. He can't just fly. He's not, you know, he's very vulnerable as a human, so he has to be clever about how he uses his arms to defend himself and how he fights. And so that dynamic of Doc Ock, just in, like, the pure fucking core superhero craftsmanship of, like, the comic book Doc Ock, and that power is perfect and amazing, and they realize it perfectly in this movie. So it's already on a great fucking head start with that side of it.
There's a reason this movie won the effects Oscar. The effects are so good, and not every single effect in the movie has aged perfectly. Other than 2001: A Space Odyssey, I don't think you can say that about any movie, you know? Effects age, and that's fine. There are definitely some shots where, like, Alfred Molina becomes CGI and he looks like a 2002 Xbox character, and those are bad effect shots. But for the most part, I'm always blown away. Those arms just look fucking real. Like, it just looks like he is walking around New York banging into the concrete with these giant mechanical arms. And they did use a mixture of, like, actual props, some animatronic stuff, some CGI stuff. It's a very savvy mixture of different effects. But yes, you watch Doc Ock in this movie and you just buy it. And I think because of that mixture of the guy with the mechanical arms, is probably one of the harder supervillains certainly in the Spider-Man Rogues Gallery to pull off in a live-action setting, but they really just did it dead on. And the way they also utilize that in the 2 big action sequences, the one at the bank and the one on the train, they go for broke. They use every inch of what makes Doc Ock a cool villain, and they get it all out there, and it's great, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like that side of it, fucking amazing, perfect. Obviously I don't want them permanently grafted to my body, but I wish I had giant, cool mechanical arms that I could just, like, it seems like it'd be so much fun to have those. So that's the side that's like, I can never dismiss that childlike glee I have at Dr. Octopus. It just makes me excited every single time.
Yes.
But let's also talk about the other side of it, which is the more Spider-Man 2 specific, like, performance side of it with Alfred Molina. I just adore what they do with this character in terms of it's this classic mad scientist story that they tell of you know, he's trying to do the right thing. He believes in the power of science. He believes in science and intelligence and knowledge being a benefit for mankind, and he wants to enact that. And there's this very, you know, I mean, a Victor von Frankenstein character is basically what he is. And it's all of that in, like, wanting to sort of expand the boundaries of science for the benefit of humanity, but there's this ego behind it as well that cannot be dismissed. And every time I watch the movie, as I get older, I feel like I detect more of that and see more of that side of it, where when I was much younger, I was so enraptured by, like, he's just, like, the coolest fucking dude, and that the dinner scene between Peter and Otto and his wife is there. Like, their interactions, he just seems so cool and down to earth and smart, and just, you know, his relationship with Peter is so casual and relaxed and natural. There's so much, like you kind of like want to have that relationship with professors in your life and mentors. It just grabs you immediately. As I get older and more sort of, I think, cynical and sort of like knowledgeable about human relationships and the way that people are, I always see more and more of there is that ego driving all of it behind that. That it's like, yes, he says it's for the good of mankind, but there is like, he wants to prove that he can do this thing, and he's not really listening to other people warning him about it until obviously it goes wrong. And that's such a good reflection of Peter, of the scientist side of Peter, of the like moral side of Peter, but of also that like, Peter and Spider-Man have an arrogance to them because Spider-Man has so much power, because he has so much capacity to do what people cannot do normally with his abilities. There's an inherent arrogance and ego in Spider-Man doing what Spider-Man does, and Spider-Man having to like sort of keep some of that in check, or he, crosses the line and does something that he can't take back. And so Doc Ock, like, showing him that side of like, if you just stepped a little bit too far on this side, you could end up like what happens to Otto and go so far down that path and turn into something like incredibly monstrous. And that's obviously like the third pillar of it. The first pillar is amazing powers and amazingly realized. The second pillar is incredible human dynamic that reflects the hero perfectly. And then the third pillar for like why I love Doc Ock so much is all the like universal horror references to him visually and dynamically and like cinematically in this film is it is that Frankenstein story, because he is both Victor Frankenstein and he is Frankenstein's monster, right? He turns himself into the monster halfway through the movie and has to sort of like bring himself back from that and find the goodness in himself again by the end. And there's such this sort of steady hand by Sam Raimi, of like such an experienced hand with the horror stuff on that like monster movie kind of track that Dr. Octopus is on, which is very different from what Green Goblin was. Like Green Goblin was like monstrous and he was psychotic and all those things, but he wasn't a like movie monster in the way that Dr. Octopus is a movie fucking monster. He is a universal horror monster, like transported out of the 30s is what it feels like to me.
Oh, totally. And I want to talk about Alfred Molina. He is so good. And he is so, as I said, not the choice you would necessarily in your head go, oh, of course that's him. And we talked about this last week a little bit too, that for a lot of the big roles, Sam Raimi did not cast the person where you look at them and go, oh, that's it. That's obviously it. There's a couple of those, like J. Jonah Jameson and Aunt May and some of those characters. But, I think Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst and James Franco and Willem Dafoe in that first movie and Alfred Molina in this one, there's a lot where you don't look at them immediately and go, that's it, Eureka. What you do is you watch the person give the performance, you watch them do a complete scene, you feel the scene winding down, and then in the back of your mind you're like, this is perfect. They got this just right. And you feel it. And for me, where you feel it with Alfred Molina is, I love that we do get a scene where Peter goes and interviews him as Peter Parker. He meets him as Peter Parker the first time. And they have this great little scene where you almost feel like this could even be another father figure for Peter, right? And there's this beautiful moment at the end where he seemingly has this perfect life and everything. And the way they cap off that scene is he starts reciting T.S. Eliot. And you see Alfred Molina recite T.S. Eliot, and me, years older than when I first saw this movie. This movie was over half my lifetime ago. Fuck.
Yeah,
12,
right.
12, I'm now 25. Yeah, about to be 26. So it's been a long time, but, as an adult now, I watch that scene, and one, I know he's going to become the bad guy, and two, I have a little more appreciation of just how he's reading that poetry, because he has this, like, great Shakespearean training to him, And it is just such a complete character he is building, And where they're going to go with it. You see how they're seeding the ground there. And it is just such a complete performance. I love it to death. Roger Ebert was a big fan of this movie. He gave it 4 stars. I think it was his number 4 movie of the year that year, which... That's pretty cool that he had it like that high on his top 10 list. And one of the things he said was like why Alfred Molina is so good is he really makes you like feel what he senses when he gets his powers. Like he makes you understand the emotive weight of the things that are happening to Otto Octavius. And I think that's a great way to look at it, because that is something that does not happen with a lot of supervillains, I think. And it is something that, because you cast a world-class actor like this and let him play a real character, he gets to have fun. There are some moments where he just gets to have fun as just bastard asshole Doc Ock. But within that, in the middle of all this, in the early scenes and in some of the later scenes, he also is a human being, and I think as like this kind of, another human pillar in the movie alongside Peter Parker and Mary Jane and Aunt May, it's a great dynamic. It's a great performance. It's such against type style casting for this sort of thing. I really love it. And I also think, as we've said, adjusting the adaptation of the character to have, Doc Ock in the comics, to my understanding, at least in the versions I've seen, he's the guy who leads the Sinister Six and shit, right?
Yes, yeah, he's the original leader of the Sinister Six.
He has a love of crime, and he's like a natural born leader, and he's out there getting shit done. He's like a crime boss almost in that sense, as well as being like an arrogant asshole genius. And they didn't have any fear to just discard those things that weren't going to work in this thematic framework and say, how can we keep some of the core pieces of this character and adapt them to the story that we want to tell about Peter Parker? And I do think that's been used in years since. Like the adaptation of Doc Ock, I think that is influential. Something like Thanos in Avengers Infinity War very much feels to me like an adaptive choice akin to Doc Ock, where Thanos in the comics he's courting death. He literally has this romantic affair with an incarnation of death and all this stuff. And they say, well, that's not really going to work with the story we want to tell, so how about we give him this motivation and build the story around that? And I don't think that's as well done as a Doc Ock, but that is often a way to do a superhero villain well in a movie where you don't have months to develop them in a comic, you have 2 hours. And you have to do it within a thematic framework. And this is the grade A example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, in all of that, I don't want to dismiss the comic booky fun side of it that they're able to have in this movie, because it's something that I think does get ignored sometimes for the very sexy human Alfred Molina, great acting component of it. Because there's a fucking part in this movie, I think it's when he goes up to meet Harry Osborn to get the tritium or whatever, more near the end of the movie, where he fucking takes off his sunglasses with the Doc Ock tentacle. It's that's some fucking Raimi shit. That's so great. Perfect. That's so beautiful, and it's just the willingness of Alfred Molina to just go with that stuff of he both gets to play, Otto Octavius, arrogant but kind scientist reciting T.S. Eliot, and he gets to take off his sunglasses with his fucking robot tentacle. The spectrum and the range that he is able to communicate in that role of both being Saturday morning cartoon villain and soulful scientist man is incredible. And it's one of the things that makes the role work and makes the whole movie work. Is it's when we were talking about the variance of tone, that doesn't just exist in the movie, it exists in the characters. And the characters can both be funny and ridiculous and scary and warm and kind and all those things in different scenes and with different dynamics. And that's the thing that makes the character so engaging to me, is that he gets to do all of it and he does it all so well.
Oh, absolutely. His sense of style, I just love the trench coat and the hat and all of that. The scene where he's at the bank and, he's kind of snooping around, and then he just is like, well, fuck it, and he just rips the door off the thing and goes for it, and he's taking all these bags, and he looks like he's out of a 30s James Cagney movie. There are some very pleasing moments like that. He even has little quips. There's the part where he just drops Aunt May and goes, Butterfingers. And I always laugh at that, because it is such a weird choice, but it totally works with him kind of going off the rails there. Yeah, he's awesome. And if you want to talk about the intersection between the universal horror stuff, the, soulful human drama stuff, the 2 key scenes of him becoming Doc Ock, the fusion reaction sequence where all of it goes down, and then the scene in the hospital, is some of Sam Raimi's best filmmaking. Just bar none, some of the best filmmaking in commercial film of that decade is, in the fusion sequence, there are just some shots that are seared into my memory. There's the one where his poor wife is about to die and the glass is flying at her, and there's the shot of her reflected in the glass that is flying at her. That's an amazing shot. There's the one of Spider-Man, pulling the cords out of the wall, and they do this above, upside down shot where it's it's a very weird angle to have Spider-Man at, but it really shows like the effort he's putting into it at that moment, and just the whole like sense of like how all that shit goes down in the fusion sequence. That's a great like villain origin story cinematic sequence to me.
Absolutely, and my favorite shot in that sequence is more near the beginning when he first puts on the arms, and it's like from the back, and he raises his human arms, and the mechanical arms start coming up, and the camera slowly moves up with it, and then the music swells. It's so good. Again, when I'm talking about like universal horror, like it's those kinds of shots are like, fucking yeah, like I almost just want this shot in like black and white with like a fog machine in the corner, because it's so perfect.
How has Universal, like, tried to make 3 new Frankenstein movies this century and never courted Sam Raimi for any of them?
Right, yeah, Jesus.
Sam Raimi would make the best... Like, if Universal wanted to make a great monster movie and have it be good and successful, why aren't they trying to get Sam Raimi to do that? Maybe he has no interest, and maybe they don't know what they're doing. One of those is definitely true. But it's like, that would be a match made in fucking heaven. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, God, let him do it in black and white.
Yeah, because you have both the, like, as you're saying, like, the sort of, like, the creation of the monster scene of the fusion reactor going wrong and all that stuff, which is more sort of, like, you know, classical kind of horror, because it's not, like, scary, but it's very tense.
It's very operatic, like, it's big, it's theatrical.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous scene, but then you get the fucking Sam Raimi just full fucking Evil Dead in that hospital scene. Which is just, we've probably talked about this scene a bunch on this podcast, like, in passing, because it is so, you know, it's one of those, it's just like ingrained in my subconscious, partially because it's like, that's a fucked up thing to put in a movie that you're going to show to kids. Like, it's so, it's so, because it's not like, it's not gory, you know, there's not blood flying everywhere, but it is so extreme of a horror scene. And the whole progression of it is this just perfect little fucking horror short movie of the doctors, which they, you know, he does the perfect thing of kind of, you know, the doctors are obviously kind of sympathetic, but there's just, the guy makes that one little joke at the beginning of like, anybody take shop class? Which that's the fucking slasher movie. Okay, now those people need to die. Because it's like, that's just a little, like, come on, dude, have a little sympathy for this guy who just got fucking, like, mechanical robot arms, like, grafted to his fucking spine.
It's
Don't
the
make a
douche
fucking
factor.
shop class joke.
Right? It's the douche factor. Like, he's just enough of a douchebag that you're like, okay, you're gonna die.
Yeah, like, it's just, you need that little thing for, like, the slasher movie justification to kill these people. And then it's just, fucking shit just goes wild, man, in that scene, and so much of it. There's such a great sort of Sam Raimi-ness to it. I think maybe like the two major ones to me are like two major shots are. I think obviously it's the one where the female doctor is being dragged into the darkness with her like nails scraping the fucking metal floor as she screams. That's just perfect. And then maybe the most Sam Raimi shot of all of them is the shot of the dude just like raising the chainsaw up into the camera, like the frame really quickly. Like that's literally just a shot from Evil Dead. That's like just fucking, it might as well be like, you know, have the guy's hand be cut off and like replace the hand with the chainsaw, like Ash Evil Dead 2 style. Like that's just what that shot is. It's so perfect. It's just gorgeous. It's such a gorgeous scene.
It is so well done. I've been thinking a lot as I'm, you know, assistant teaching this intro to film class of like, how would I teach an intro to film class if I were doing this? Like if I were writing my own syllabus. And I don't know if Spider-Man 2 is a movie I would teach on the whole, just because I don't know if there's any one topic it would perfectly fit for. But I would 100% teach that scene of just like how you can build in the edit, in the mise-en-scène, in the performances, like build a tone. It is an amazing construction. I agree. The chainsaw thing is the best part because it's not just that it is iconic style imagery that is calling back to Raimi's own past works, but just like the specific, precise choice of shots. Like he raises the chainsaw, he gets killed, the chainsaw drops, and we hear it like dying, and the last shot is just the chainsaw itself. Like I actually think it's really interesting how that sequence elides gore. It's really good in suggesting horror without, for the most part, directly showing any violence. And that's a really impressive thing. Because we know Sam Raimi can show violence if he wants to.
Oh, yeah. Like, you have to feel like there is, like, Sam Raimi wanted to, like, make a private, his own version of that scene. There's, like, he just shows up with, like, these fucking buckets full of fake blood. It's like, we're doing one for the edit and one for me. You know,
one for my private collection.
Yeah.
Yes, but no, it is amazingly effective without the gore. I actually have a fun story about this. So when I saw this as a kid, and I was going to that press screening, the day of the press screening, I got a call from my editor at this. So I wrote for this section of the paper called the Colorado Kids, and it was in the Denver Post, and it was every Wednesday, and it was a section written by kids, and I did the movie reviews, like I said. And my editor calls me up.
I mean, you were the movie kid.
I was the movie kid, and the editor calls me up and says, "Hey, movie kid, you got a second?" And I say, yes, the movie kid has it. He called me on the movie kid phone. It's like the Batman series. They have the red phone for the movie kid. And he called me on it and he said, "You're seeing Spider-Man 2 tonight, right?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Who were you bringing as your plus one?" And I said, "Oh, I was going to bring my little brother." He said, how old's your little brother? And I said, "Well, I'm 12. He's 9. And he said, "Well, I just wanted you to know, this movie is a PG-13, and it's a hard PG-13. There's this one scene in the movie that, like, is your brother okay with, like, more extreme horror stuff?" And I'm like, I think he'll be fine. And he's like, "It's just, this movie gets pretty rough, just so you know." And he said, "And I want you to talk about it in the review, too," just as like a kind of, because we did parental warning kind of things. And I remember getting to that scene in the theater and being like, oh, that's what he warned me about. And Thomas was fine. I was fine. Like, for my part, this scene doesn't scare me. It just gets you jazzed. Like, or if it does scare you, it's scaring you in a way that makes you excited and happy. And I remember just looking at Thomas, watching that scene, being like, oh, God, that was so great. It feels like, as a kid, you got away with something, getting to watch a scene like that, you know?
100%. It is those kinds of things where it's like, I can't believe this is in this movie. This is amazing. It's just like, there's just like fucking people getting whipped around and thrown across the room and their fucking necks breaking. It's fucking great.
There's that one
part.
What
a fucking scene.
There's that one part where you zoom in on Doc Ock's face as he's doing this, and he's got this like little evil smile on, and he's throwing these people around the room.
And yeah, his body is getting jostled by the like force of the tentacles. Oh man.
I mean, God knows how many times I've seen this movie, and I was watching it this afternoon. I'm 25 now, and I'm just cackling to myself because I still can't believe he got away with this. There's, like, you know, superhero movies have done some fun, formal experimentations, but just like, okay, for 5 minutes here, let's just go full horror. I don't think there's anything else quite like it in the genre. It's so great.
Yeah, it's just, I fucking have a massive smile on my face every single time I watch that scene. It's so perfect. It really is like you said, it would be a kind of thing that would be such a great example to show to a class and just like go shot by shot through that scene and like cut by cut. It's like, how do you construct this? Because it's in such a digestible format and it's so perfect.
You could tell that sequence through still images. You could just take a still of every shot, put them on together like a storyboard, and you would feel the effect of the sequence. It is masterfully done, yes. And we could do a whole podcast on that fucking hospital scene, but we should probably move on. I do like that the hospital scene ends with a well-earned no, which, again, very Universal Monster and very much earned. They build to it, you know. It's well done. Yes. All right. What else we got in this whole stretch of the movie? So, on the other side of things, of course, this movie is doing the Spider-Man No More arc. And let's talk about the things that kind of lead Peter Parker up to deciding he's not going to be Spider-Man anymore. He fights Dr. Octopus, and that happens. And then he's webbing his way home, and he is unable to web, and he falls down and hurts his back, and it looks very, very painful. And I'm glad Tobey Maguire survived. I don't think they actually dropped Tobey Maguire that far. But you start to get this... I think this is always an interesting element of it, where they make the Spidey powers kind of like erectile dysfunction in this movie, where...
Sure, that's one way to phrase it.
Where it's like, it's all in his head, and but I think it's an interesting thing, where it's like the powers are so a part of him, it's not just like this active choice, he says one day, where like he pulls the web shooters off, because the web shooters are in him and all the powers are internal, it becomes this like physical manifestation of internal doubt. I've always liked that, and I think it's something that... We didn't talk about this. I've always thought the adaptation choice to not have physical web shooters and have it be part of his actual like DNA powers, I've always thought that was a brilliant adaptation choice. It simplifies the storytelling for one, but I also just think it's kind of more cool and cinematic. But it also means that because there's no like technology component to Spider-Man's powers, you can do it all so internally in this movie, and they use it very well here. And that whole side of the film I really like.
Yeah, I agree. It's just the kind of thing where there's an element in some of those older Spider-Man stories where there's actually there's a surprising number of Spider-Man stories from the first 50 or so issues that are all around Spider-Man thinking he's gone insane. There's 3 or 4 of them where it's I have to visit the psychiatrist that's secretly Mysterio, and it's there's a bunch of those stories with a weirdly short amount of time. And one of around there, I think there is a story. It's not issue 50, which is the Spider-Man No More one, but there is one that is about Spider-Man temporarily losing his powers and having to sort of figure out how do I deal with this. It is great because he's up on a building or something, and all of a sudden he's oh shit. You never think about that, oh yeah, Spider-Man. Part of what makes Peter Parker Spider-Man able to be so confident, just running around on rooftops, is he has this perfect sense of balance that his spider powers give you, which is not one of the superpowers you usually think about that much. You usually think about super strength and speed and stuff. It's no, he has perfect balance, and when his powers go away, he's oh fuck, I am very high up, and this is very scary. And so those issues are really good. But yeah, I think the choice in this movie to kind of combine a number of those different, the psychiatrist kind of angle of it, the losing his powers angle of it, and the I'm going to choose not to be Spider-Man anymore. I think putting all 3 of those pieces together was a really smart choice for this movie, and it's kind of picking up these different kind of building blocks from the comic books and putting them together to make a more sort of pointed version of the story than all 3 of those individually. We're kind of talking about the same thing, but from a slightly different perspective, and this just kind of mashes it all together, and it works really well.
Yes. You get the scene there with the first time he loses his powers where he's going down the elevator. I think that is a very funny sequence in the theatrical cut. The scene they swap it out with in the extended cut, where the guy does a totally different comedy bit, is not funny and it doesn't work. But in the original
it's
cut,
too long.
Yeah, it's too long. But the one in the theatrical cut, it's he's not sure if this is Spider-Man or a guy cosplaying as Spider-Man, and so it's just nice suit. Yeah, thanks. Where'd you get it? Oh, I made it myself. It's okay. It rides up in the crotch a little. It's just this great little, very, small talk moment with Spider-Man in an elevator. I've always found that funny.
Yeah, I've always particularly liked when Peter does the, it rides up in the crotch a little, because, the way it's performed by Tobey Maguire makes it feel like he's had this moment where it's he's never been able to say this to anybody ever, because when is he going to chat with somebody about the travails of wearing this skin tight, super uncomfortable Spider-Man costume, and in the middle of this elevator conversation with a dude he has no idea who he is, just he's yeah, you know what? It does ride up in the crotch a little bit. I get to kind of just sort of vent about this a little bit. It's a really good little delivery.
It's great, yeah. You have the whole sequence that follows later in the film where there's 2 great musical montages in this movie. There's Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, which we'll get to because I love that scene passionately. There's also the scene where he is going on his way to the play, and I forget the name of the song that's playing there. Great little musical montage, because this is a moment where it's he has prepared, he's set time aside. Peter is really trying in this scene, and life still shits on him. He has to go into Spider-Man mode and save all these people, and of course he never would not prefer to do that. He has to save these people. He would not want 50 people to die so he could go see a play. That would be very bad. But he saves those people, and then he is not able to get in, and we get our Bruce Campbell cameo. And we'll get to all of that, because this is an exquisite Bruce Campbell cameo. But I do love there's a moment where he does the truck comes and is about to run him over, and he does the big flip and then lands, and the 2 kids are whoa, how'd you do that? And he says, well, work out. Do your homework, eat your green vegetables, and the little kid, I love this delivery, that's what my mom is always saying. I just never actually believed her. Having superheroes interact with little kids is a hit and miss thing. That is perfect. That is just a great joke.
I mean, it's just one of every example of the extras in the Spider-Man movies are so perfect.
Oh, good,
like
great.
it's very apparent once you get to the the train scene that has like a bunch of extras that have to interact with Spider-Man that works so well. But yeah, it's just like the random people on the street, the random New Yorkers, whether it's in like the kind of talking head interview stuff they do in these movies, or it's those kids, or it's like the violin lady playing the fucking Spider-Man cartoon theme. Like all of them are perfect. Like I don't know how Sam Raimi does that, but it's just fucking perfect. Every single one of those performances.
Yeah, these movies are... We've talked about how well cast they are. They're well cast down to the extras, as you say. Just people in the back, whether they have a line or not. Just like the people who have to like go, ooh, ah, back and forth as Spider-Man swings overhead. They're just all perfectly cast. It is a really amazing little thing. We do get the scene at the play. Bruce Campbell gets the cameo. I did have a thought earlier, as you were talking about the scene in the hospital, that there could have been an opportunity to have him be the lead surgeon in the hospital.
Oh, man.
That would have also been an amazing cameo. But that would have taken away from my headcanon, which is that Bruce Campbell is playing one character in these three movies who just has a lot of weird different jobs.
Absolutely. I don't think that's headcanon. I think that is... The movies never make a specific nod, but I think it has to be. It has to be that this dude, like 2 years ago, was the like MC for this weird underground wrestling arena, and then it's like he lost that job because fucking Spider-Man beat Bonesaw, and like they lost all their money because actually they were robbed, so they didn't lose all their money. I forgot about that part. And so then he's like, well, fuck, I can't work there anymore. It's like, who's hiring? Well, this weird theater's hiring. Fuck it, okay, I'll work there as an usher. That's like weirdly aggressive.
Yes. But how great would it have been to have Bruce Campbell doing the thing of, like, anybody take shop class?
Yeah, that's a fucking Ash line. That is a very Ash line.
Yes.
But the only problem with that is that then Bruce Campbell would have to die, and then you wouldn't be able to give him a cameo in Spider-Man 3 if it's the same character.
Exactly. So. And his cameo in this one is fucking funny. He is just so... I love... Peter comes in and he says, oh, you should... And he's like, okay, and he ties his shoes. Like, oh, you're tied. He like checks his tie and then comes and says, what are you here for? It's such a great little physical comedy thing where he's just fucking with this kid. It's like what are you here for? All dressed up at the play. I'm here for the play. You're not going into the play. I love it.
Yeah, I love the whole bit about it. It's like, it's you can't go in halfway through. It helps maintain the illusion.
The way he leans in and says illusion.
It's just, fucking... Bruce Campbell is just so amazing. It's just fucking such a brilliant, funny fucking actor. And yeah, his cameo in the first movie is still my favorite, but... Fucking, it's such a funny scene in this movie.
Oh, I think his cameo in the first is probably the best holistically. I think this one is his funniest. This one makes me laugh the hardest.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, this is the most like sort of pointed little like comedy routine. Like this is kind of like with the hospital scene that you could just cut out and watch it as a horror short movie and enjoy it that way. You could just cut this out and watch it as a little comedy like skit on Saturday Night Live or something. It'd be hilarious.
Yes, it's great. I think the extended version of this scene in the 2.1 version is unnecessary, but it is funny to see him do even more little gesticulations. It's very good. And one of the parts I'm most looking forward to in Spider-Man 3 is his cameo there, because it's also really good. So we shall get there.
So how much do you love, now that you've watched The Evil Dead, much do you love like seeing like Bruce Campbell starting there and then like being able to be like fucking amazing cameo dude in Spider-Man movies?
The only thing is, it makes me sad that he and Sam Raimi haven't done a full movie together in a while, since the 90s.
Yeah.
And I really want them to at some... I just want Sam Raimi to make like a small style horror film again. Like the last one he did was Drag Me to Hell, and that one does not have Campbell in it. So I want them to do something together again. Frankly, I would just like Raimi to work again, because his last movie was Oz the Great and Powerful, and that's 1, 5 years old now, and 2, not very good. So... Anyway, all right, yes. So we have that whole sequence. There's a great moment where, let me see if I have. Oh, that's later. But I was going to mention there's the part where Peter goes and like does the photographs at the planetarium, the event for John Jameson. The intro into that sequence, it's actually a little bit before that. There's this really weird transition where J. Jonah Jameson, a few scenes earlier, tells Spider-Man, well, he tells Peter, you're fired, and then he's unfired because he needs him for the planetarium scene, and says, planetarium, tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, there's the door, and then they do this weird watery dissolve from, like, Jonah saying that line to Doc Ock down at the pier. I've never understood why that was the choice made there. It's utterly bizarre. For one, it feels like that scene should probably it should like have been placed later and cut us into the planetarium scene. Instead, I think it's actually, there's a couple things in between there, but also just the choice of like, it's a literal water dissolve, like you would do to like go into a flashback, and now we're at the pier with Doc Ock. I don't understand why it's there. I kind of love it. It's so eccentric.
Yeah, I noticed it on this watch as well. It's like, that's such a strange choice, but I'm fucking here for it, man. I'm here for, whatever you need to do a weird cut from one scene to another scene, as we did in our fucking Star Wars discussions. I'm here for it. Like, weird fades, weird dissolves. You fucking have like 7 squares on the screen that like swap in and out until the scene is like shot is there. Fucking, I'm here for it because I love that shit. I eat it up.
We mentioned earlier the scene at the bank where Aunt May and Peter are there, and then it's Spider-Man, Aunt May, and Dr. Octopus having an action sequence together, which is great. Another actor who would go on to big things years later in this scene is Joel McHale, is the cashier there that they're talking to, or the bank teller, which is just, like, Joel McHale did not become famous until, like, 2011 or 12, so, like, this was years ahead of the curve on that one. It's just, again, the casting in these movies is kind of crazy. I like that Aunt May keeps kicking him and slapping his hand. Yeah. That's great. I love that Doc Ock is just flinging bags full of gold coins at Spider-Man and just raining it down on the bank. Because, honestly, for that bank, that's probably worse than just straight up getting robbed, is having their coins just scattered throughout the bank.
I love the little moment where Doc Ock is throwing those bags of coins at Spider-Man, and then he finally hits him, and he's just like, ha! Like, there's this, like, it's that, again, when we talk about, like, the little touches in these movies, it's just like, that's like, fucking, yeah, I finally got you asshole. Ugh.
That one's great.
Very good.
Spider-Man does not do a lot of quips in the Raimi films. He has one here that I like, which is, here's your change.
Yeah.
It's a good one, as he flings a bag full of coins back at him. We already kind of mentioned this whole action sequence. It's great. My favorite moment in the whole thing is, well, my favorite moment might be Aunt May, hitting Doc Ock with the umbrella. I also love when she thinks she's about to fall as she's holding onto the umbrella, but then she's on a ledge, and she looks up at the statue, and it's like a religious, like, angel statue, and she goes, oh, thank you. That is such a great Aunt May moment. Like, of course, Rosemary Harris's Aunt May would be like, yes, this was divine intervention, thank you. It's adorable, I love it.
Yeah, and it's that little thing of, like, it kind of connects with the first movie and her doing the prayer in the first movie. Yes. Like, it's consistent with her character that she has this religious outlook.
Yeah, I love it. All right, let's see. So that's the whole bank sequence. We should talk about probably the whole series of events that ultimately pushes Peter to give up being Spider-Man. Within all of that is, I mentioned before in last week's show that my favorite Uncle Ben scene is not in Spider-Man 1, it's in Spider-Man 2, and it is the scene where Peter is sitting on his bed. I think it's after the planetarium scene where MJ is going to get married. He still doesn't have his powers, or something is going wrong. He's seen the doctor. He doesn't know what to do. And they basically just cut to like this dream sequence where he is back in the car with Uncle Ben, and they're talking about responsibility, and he's trying to admit to Uncle Ben that he just can't live up to this anymore, and Uncle Ben, his like eyes well with tears. That is one of those scenes that's just seared in my mind. It is so beautiful. It's so elegaic. I love that is the moment where he chooses not to be Spider-Man anymore, is this internal projection with Uncle Ben. There's so many ways you could have done that. That is such an artistic and beautiful way to do it, and a great use of Cliff Robertson.
Yeah, and that scene is so gorgeous with the, like kind of the blown out white background, like they're, in heaven. And it's, the performances by both Tobey Maguire and Cliff Robertson is so good. And when Tobey has to give that line at the end where he's like, and I am Spider-Man no more. Like, there's something about that delivery that always really hits me in my gut. Even if it is like a, weird little, like, reference to the title of the Amazing Spider-Man 50, it's like they deliver it so perfectly. And it's such a good phrase, it strikes me really powerfully every time.
After that, you also get the scene where he leaves the suit in the trash, which, correct me if I'm wrong, that is one of the most direct recreations of a comic panel in any superhero movie.
Yes, yeah, the trash can front and center with the suit and like the mask and the glove dangling out and him walking and his back turned. Yes, that is basically just a shot reconstruction of one of the more iconic panels from the Amazing Spider-Man 50.
Yeah, because we've talked about this before. Other than something like Zack Snyder's Watchmen or something like that, where they're directing like a close-ended like one comic book, as in a graphic novel.
Graphic novel, quote unquote.
Other than that, most comic book movies, they are adaptations of like the idea of the character or the general history of the character, but they are not adaptations of any specific arc. The Raimi films are much more engaged with actual like Spider-Man comic material than most comic book movies are, and you get direct quotes like that, which I think is just a cool, interesting detail in these films.
Yeah, they're so rooted in the general style and aesthetic and core of like the 60s, 70s Spider-Man comics that it is, like it's, again, like neither of the movies are direct adaptations of specific storylines and they change a lot of things. But as you say, like it's just like they take bits and pieces and will quote lines or quote, images from those comics and sort of take different story ideas and play with them. It's like you can definitely feel that Raimi and the other people making these movies had a like affection for and sort of groundedness in the character that is pretty different from a lot of the different comic book adaptations.
Yes, exactly. And it's really cool when you get a moment like that. I also love on that scene, on that shot that is the comic book panel, they do the fade out, and it fades out but leaves his two lens pieces in from his eyes, and so you end it with this black shot. It's all black, but you have Spider-Man's two eyepieces still in the shot. Perfect. It's a great shot.
So good, yeah. It's just like, it gets me every time. It's just so... because it's one of those things where it's like, that should be such a hokey choice to make. It works so well. It's so perfect.
Yes. And then we get the scene that I think is the biggest Rorschach test of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. This is the scene where you are either on board and in movie heaven, or you're rolling your eyes and have no fucking soul, and that is Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. It's a beautiful montage.
I love it.
Fucking
hell, man.
I love it.
What other movie would have a sequence like this in it? It's so weird. It's so cornball to just be like, let's just fucking do it, man. And have Tobey Maguire just like strutting to the camera and he trips and falls. He gets back up and he slips his fucking glasses on. It's like, yeah, now I'm really grooving.
And he's happy and he's walking around. He gets a hot dog. He sees the cops go by and he bites into the hot dog. You have that. You have the end of the montage is Dr. Connors comes by and like pats him on the back and says, "Great job in class today." And then he walks towards the frame and we get a freeze frame on Toby's goofy face as he happily jaunts forward towards the camera. It is so silly and it is so beautiful. I love it because the movie for the last like 20, 30 minutes has been so... It's not dark. It's not Logan or something, but it's like, it is dour. It is sad. He's dealing with a lot of internal issues. His love of his life is getting married. He doesn't have his powers. Doc Ock is wreaking havoc and all this shit. And he's had that really sad scene with Uncle Ben. And then we come back and what it does is it expresses what Peter feels like. And I think that's an easy thing to kind of get lost in, but he just let this burden off of his shoulders. And we need to, in a short amount of time, try to express to the audience, how does Peter feel about making this choice to go back to a life without Spider-Man? Well, you do it with a couple of shots, Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head, and a big, goofy Tobey Maguire smile. I don't think there's a better way to do it. Yeah, no, I 100% agree, because it is something where, you have spent so much time just, again, shitting on Peter Parker. Like we kind of skipped over some of the stuff at the planetarium scene. One of my favorite running little gags in that bit is, because I think it's also how the scene is started, is Peter trying to get like an hors d'oeuvre or something off of a plate and someone else takes it. It happens to him like 5 times over the course of that scene. He finally gets the glass and tries to take a drink from it and then realizes it's empty. It's like, it's the first half of the movie is
everything goes wrong with Peter, even something as simple as he can't get, like, an appetizer at the fucking party because it's always taken away from him before he can snatch it. So it's like the movie has shat on Peter Parker so much by this point that it does have to, like, the only way to express, like, the joy and the lifting of that burden from his shoulders is with a goofy musical montage. And it is, I think, the fucking cherry on top of the sundae, like the fucking piece de resistance of the scene is the freeze frame.
Oh, the freeze frame is so good.
Like, what fucking movies, other than, like, The Breakfast Club and, like, I don't know, some, like, 80s sports film that has fucking freeze frames in it, right? Like, that's just, like, movies just don't do that. It's such a goofy, silly, like, technique to use in a fucking, like, to pay money to go sit down in a fucking theater movie, and it's just, you get this, like, beautiful, just, like, fucking blurry, like, freeze frame right on his smile as he's stepping towards the frame. It's just perfect.
It's so great. I love the music. I love the way it all blends together. It's a beautiful sequence. And also, if I could take one thing from the 2.1 version of this movie and put it back in the normal theatrical cut, I had totally forgotten this is in there. There's an alternate cut of the part where he puts his glasses back on and keeps walking, where Raimi cuts to this really weird split screen effect where Peter is in the middle of the frame and kind of like a kaleidoscope of two big dumb Tobey Maguire faces is on either side of him grinning, and it's really hard to describe. It's like this super like shitty 1970s kind of split screen effect where like he's being almost like projected on himself on either side, and I just have to imagine that was one where like they cut that together and they got a note like, no, we're not putting this in our big studio movie for the summer. And Raimi's like, and we'll save it for the DVD. And like choose your battles, you know, like I'm going to save the scene at the hospital. But I love, it is just so eccentric. It's so good.
Yeah. It is, you know, that is when I talk about there's like a couple of moments from the 2.1 cut that I wish were the theatrical. That is maybe the one on top of the list. It's like, it might be my favorite shot in any of these movies. Just like, it is so audacious. The idea of fucking, as you said, it's like two giant mirrored Tobey Maguire faces on the left and right side of the screen with Tobey walking towards the camera in the middle is like one of the strangest shots I've seen. I was just like, it's not like it's insane or anything. It's just like such a peculiar idea that you would ever even try to do that, and it's so good.
And it fits the sequence so perfectly. It's a great precursor to the freeze frame at the end, and I see why they left it out of the theatrical cut, because it is a pretty big ask, 20 seconds into this silly musical montage to have an audience go with that. But I love that it was anybody's instinct on this movie to cut that crazy thing in there. It's wonderful. And it really is, they've knocked Peter down so far. For the rest of the movie to work, you have to build him back up. You have to build him back up and feel the happiness he feels there. And then you can start deconstructing that. And Peter can start noticing how he's not going to be fully happy this way either. And that's the magic of this movie, is that it rides that emotional wave, and it can ride it with a silly sequence like this, but that silly sequence is so key to the emotional arc of this movie.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't remember where it falls, because you have that scene, he goes and visits Mary Jane at the play, we already talked about that. Somewhere in here, I just have to say there's my other favorite Spider-Man 2.1 edition, is where you have a little extra on a scene with J. Jonah Jameson. I forget what the scene is, but at the beginning he's talking to his wife, and he says, "Dear, we agreed to put on a wedding, not go into bankruptcy." And that is just such a great J. Jonah Jameson line. I think it's the line where they're talking. The larger scene is him talking to his wife about the caterer. And that scene is where the dude comes in, the construction worker guy, and brings them the suit he found in the garbage.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and he gets the suit and realizes he put Spider-Man out of business, and Bill Nunn is very sad, which is too bad, because I don't want to see Bill Nunn sad.
I love that little scene because everybody else in the room, like Robbie and Betty Brant, are all like just aghast and so horrified. They're like, "Oh no, Spider-Man's quit," because obviously they understand the consequences of that. And Jonah's just fucking cackling to himself. It's like, "Aha! The triumph of the press."
Yes, that's great. And my goal in life now is to one day get to a position where, like, I have a child, they're going to get married, and I can say to my significant other, "Dear, we agreed to put on a wedding, not go into bankruptcy," because which is a great cheapskate line.
Yeah.
All right. One of the scenes that comes up after this that I think is one of the most remarkable in the film is Peter and May go to visit Uncle Ben's grave, and then they come home, and Aunt May is kind of beating herself up because she says, like, oh, if only I had let you take the subway that day, Ben wouldn't have brought the car and he wouldn't have gotten carjacked and shot. And Peter feels so overcome with guilt, and he's left Spider-Man behind, so he kind of feels like he can finally say it, and he confesses to her what happened to Uncle Ben and what his role in it was. That's another one of those, kind of like the hospital scene, but in a completely different way. I can't believe that's in this movie. There's just an emotional rawness to that. To go back to the superhero's origin and have them just talk it through, and there's no pyrotechnics, there's no clever like editing where they go back and like show the scene from the first movie. It's just Toby and it's just Rosemary Harris talking, and she's not even talking, she's just listening horrified, and she walks out at the end, and it's this unburdening, and I think it is one of the most beautiful scenes in this movie.
Yeah, I love that scene so much, and as far as I know, I will find out in 5 years when I finish my fucking Spider-Man comic project, but I don't think that scene has any precedence, at least so far, up to 1982 of Spider-Man comic books. That scene has not happened. Peter has never told Aunt May. I think maybe that something like that happens in the Straczynski run in the early 2000s. I don't know if that would be pre or post Spider-Man 2, because then Aunt May kind of gets more involved with the Spider-Man side of things. But generally speaking, like, that's just not... That's not a dynamic that's really explored in such a way that, like, it kind of surprises me every time I watch the movie. This, like, because I remember that scene's in there, but I just usually don't think about the idea of Peter needing to confess to Aunt May his role in Uncle Ben's death, because so much of that trauma is so internal for Peter that it's like he doesn't fucking talk to anybody about that in anything because it's so personal to him. But it works perfectly in this movie. I think it's just it's one of those many choices that they make to sort of like pull. It was like it makes me think of what you said earlier, the conversation, Jonathan, of like they leave everything on the field. This is like the scene that feels like that. It's like you fucking like went out there and you did it. And like superhero movies do not have a scene like this. You know, they don't have a scene that's that sort of like personal and emotional that digs into the sort of like the kind of like the dirty roots of the character that way and just like throw it out there on screen. And it's a really powerful scene.
It's amazing. I love it. It's like you said, there's not a lot of precedent for this. And I also think in terms of those spaces Raimi creates for his actors, there is real raw acting going on in this scene. And it's one of those scenes where I watch it and I just think, fuck everyone who makes fun of Tobey Maguire for these movies. You know, fuck them. They're thinking about is like, oh, he doesn't quip enough as Spider-Man, and there's that one goofy scene where he does some like weird disco dancing in Spider-Man 3. Fuck that. That is such surfacey bullshit that has no place in criticism. Watch him in this scene. Watch what he does at that kitchen table. That is acting. That is a level of acting that people are not usually allowed to do in these movies. It is beautiful. I think Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man is still just one of the single best performances of any superhero character. And it's moments like those, because he can go to that place, and then he can suit up and go be Spider-Man 2 and play something like the scene on the train later on. But it's amazing. It's really remarkable to me.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
They're gushing about it. That, of course, kind of tees up a later scene with Aunt May. All this guilt is kind of building on Peter. He starts seeing... We have that one scene with the hot dog in the Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head sequence. But he starts to see these like crimes going on and realizing, oh, I'm not stopping these, right? And there's the one in the Raindrop sequence. There's one where he's walking by and a guy is getting mugged and there's nothing he can do. And he unburdens himself to Aunt May. And then, of course, kind of the key sequence in the movie is he comes by Aunt May's house and she is moving out because the bank is going to foreclose. And she's like, fuck it, I'm going to go get an apartment. And she's working with little Henry Jackson, who is helping her move. And they have a heart-to-heart in a sequence that both beautifully summarizes the themes, not just of this movie, but of Spider-Man as a character, and also makes me 100% sure Aunt May knows Peter is Spider-Man in this movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We'll talk about that.
Like, it's interesting because it kind of feels like she's she figures it out in between the last scene and this scene. I think she kind of like finally puts it together, maybe like sort of based off of what Peter has revealed to her that, okay, he's got to be Spider-Man. Like, that's got to be what this is. But yeah, that scene, one thing I would recommend you, Jonathan, or like anybody else who was a kid around when these movies came out to do is go and watch. There were 2 main trailers for Spider-Man 2. And go rewatch those trailers, because one of them, the first one, is the one that most of it is the scene between Peter and MJ we'll get to, of them in the cafe, and fucking Doc Ock throws the car through the window and he jumps in. This like great fucking trailer for a Spider-Man movie. And then the second one is one that opens up with Aunt May saying the line, "I believe there's a hero in all of us," and she kind of they kind of like cut together a version of that speech, because it's like, because I think the reason why that speech and that line, "I believe there's a hero in all of us," is so ingrained into my subconscious is because it was at the front of that fucking trailer, and God knows how many times I saw that trailer.
I still remember, like, shot for shot the trailers for this movie, because I know exactly what you're talking about. These movies had good trailers.
Yeah, and so, although, like, also then when you actually go back and rewatch the trailer all the way through, you're like, man, fucking trailers were so different in 2004. Yes. Like, holy shit, there's like this whole, like, orchestral, like, bop, 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 like, music that's going, like, fucking, what's going on? Like, there's no Inception bomb, there's no, like, dark, somber cover of a pop culture song. Like, what is going on? I don't even understand why you make a trailer without those things in them. But yeah, like, this whole scene with Aunt May, to kind of get back to the point, like, that speech is so, like, it's just in my brain. It's just, like, in my brain stem, you know, that I believe there's a hero in all of us. And that whole, but it's not just like that speech. Obviously, the speech is beautiful. It's beautifully performed, but it is, like, the setup into it and, like, the slow, like, build up to it. I also love the part where Peter tries to kind of, like, broach the subject of what they talked about in their last meeting. And she's like, oh, pish posh, it's water over the dam or under the bridge or wherever you like it. But it was very brave of you to tell me the truth, and I love you and I respect you and all that stuff. Like, that whole scene is structured in such an immaculate way to build up to the big, you know, Alfred from the Christopher Nolan Batman movies-esque big emotional speech, but this one, like, really cuts to the heart of it to me.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read the speech out just so we can talk about it. It's a beautiful piece of writing. I just want to break this down. So they're talking about Henry Jackson, who wants to be Spider-Man, and she says he knows a hero when he sees one. Too few characters out there flying around like that, saving old girls like me. And Lord knows, kids like Henry need a hero. Courageous, self-sacrificing people setting examples for all of us. Everybody loves a hero. People line up for them, cheer them, scream their names. And years later, they'll tell how they stood in the rain for hours just to get a glimpse of the one who taught them to hold on a second longer. I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble, and finally allows us to die with pride, even though sometimes we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most, even our dreams. Spider-Man did that for Henry, and he wonders where he's gone. He needs him. That's just good writing. That's just good fucking English language construction to convey an idea. It's beautiful, and I think Rosemary Harris's delivery of it is beautiful. And having that be this specific catalyst that makes Peter start to reconsider things is fantastic.
Yeah, and it's just one of those things where it's like thinking about other superhero movies and other like superhero characters is one of the things I love so much about Spider-Man as a character is that you can have a scene like that in a superhero thing where it's like, they're just moving crap in the backyard. And it's like, they're just in like some random neighborhood in Queens, you know? It's not some gigantic, like, Avengers Tower mansion. Like, it's not fucking the Fortress of Solitude or the Batcave. It's like, it's just some, like, old house from, like, the early 20th century in an old neighborhood in Queens. And it's Peter and his aunt and this, like, neighborhood kid there all standing and talking. And there's something so grounded about that that's, like, most superhero characters do not have like a space to be able to do something with that. And it's one of like all those kinds of scenes in these movies feel like it would be interesting to see somebody like cut together a version of these movies that has no Spider-Man in it, because I feel like you could do that. I feel like you could just like cut Spider-Man out almost entirely, and there's just this very grounded human story about people living in New York and like dealing with these sort of like the economic conditions of the time and of like their sort of socioeconomic class. Like that movie is just in there, and you get to have Spider-Man go around swing and have cool action stuff to sort of heighten it up and make it more digestible. But it's like there's just this core human drama that's sitting there about normal people in the heart of all of that.
Yeah, I think it's the scene before this one where he rescues the little kid from the burning building. Is that right?
Yes,
that is such another just great sequence because we're in a stretch of the movie that is largely without action. Doc Ock is mostly gone. Peter obviously is not Spider-Man, so he can't really participate in action scenes. And this is the closest we get to a big action scene in this stretch of the movie. But again, it really is about this human element here, where he goes into this building because he just can't live with himself letting a kid die. He's going to try to do something. And he saves the kid. He brings the kid back to the kid's family. And then as he's, getting medical care and getting oxygen, he hears that there was another person up on another floor who died. And all he can think is, man, if I were Spider-Man, this would have been one easier and nobody would have died. And that's also just so interesting to me because the scale. This is another. You're talking about scale, like they're in a weird house in Queens, right? Not a weird house, but like a little house in Queens. In this scene, it's not, oh man, I was an Iron Man today, and the Chitauri invaded and destroyed New York. That's not it.
Right.
It's I wasn't Spider-Man today, and one guy died in a burning building. And that feels so real. It is not detached from reality. It is a human being lost their life, and I'm feeling it. And Spider-Man feels that. It is not detached or heightened. It's just this raw, daily thing. It's not Peter's fault. He didn't start the fire. People die, but he feels it. He had that power. He had that responsibility. And in this moment, he could not fulfill it, despite putting his life on the line and making the best effort. And I think that's another just remarkable sequence in this movie.
Yeah, I agree. Everything, it's such a crushing moment. I think there's something about the way they stage it, because you go from such a triumph to realizing, but you could always give more, and, it really makes you feel the loss of that, a person in character that you never see. They're only mentioned by that firefighter.
Yeah.
But another brief moment in that sequence that is another just you keep on talking about these little Raimi touches, these little extra special moments. One of those is in that scene in the burning building when he tries to make that jump and the floor crumbles and he's holding on by his hands and the little kid tries to help pull him up. That fucking gets me every time. There's something about that of it's. Again, it's one of those of all these movies have dozens of these little extra special touches. That's most movies wouldn't think to put that little moment in there. They wouldn't focus on that. It's the little girl probably wouldn't even be in those shots. They would just focus on Peter almost falling and then climbing back up. It's having that little extra human touch of having the little girl go and grab his hand and try to help pull him up too is perfect.
Yes. I also, just a little thing in this movie, it's true of the first one as well that I like, is that while the main cast is very white, and if you were to make Spider-Man today, you would probably want to, put some diversity in there among the main cast. I mean, Homecoming does that. His best friend is Asian. I do like that the denizens of New York are very diverse. It looks like the citizenry of New York, like Spider-Man is saving black kids and Latino kids, and in this case, I think it's a Korean immigrant family, and just moments like that where it's it's enough to again, it's not what we would call full racial diversity now, but this is back in the time when Friends was still on the air, and people were talking about how for 10 years Friends showed a version of New York where there were literally no non-white people ever on that show. So, significant in part, and I think interesting to me.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so what else we got here? Peter decides to become Spider-Man again. Well, okay, he's decided that, and so he has the scene, the other big trailer scene you were talking about, which is where Mary Jane meets him again, and Peter is about to going back on his romance with her, however you want to say that. If that scene went through, I imagine Mary Jane would be very fucking annoyed, because boy is he toying with her at this point.
Yeah, like, if Doc Ock had not shown up, like, Doc Ock saved Peter from, like, the slap to end all fucking slaps, because he's fucking coming for it, man.
Yes. Because, and it's a great little sequence. There's a reason it was in the trailers. It's very evocative. Do you think when she asks him to kiss her, is it that she wants to know if this is the kind of kiss that will make her feel like she's on the moon, as John Jameson says, or is she trying to figure out if he's Spider-Man, or is it a little column A, little column B?
I think it's the little column A, little column B.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I think it's that when she does the upside down kiss with John Jameson earlier in the movie, there's that, like, I don't think that at that point she necessarily is putting together that Spider-Man is Peter consciously, but I think there's, like, a subconscious component to it. And I think she's, like, working through that subconsciously of that, like, her feelings to Spider-Man and her feelings to Peter Parker are connected in some way. I think she's, like, slowly getting to that point until, obviously, it's revealed to her at the end of the movie.
I think she's thinking there are exactly two people who have ever made me feel this way, and maybe they're not two people. Maybe they're one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have that, and then I have to say, if Doc Ock's goal was to bring Peter Parker, or get the information from Peter Parker so he could go get Spider-Man, chucking a fucking car at Peter Parker, who, to Doc Ock's knowledge, is just a photographer at the Daily Bugle and is not superpowered and will be able to save himself and Mary Jane from that car, that could have been really, like, self-destructive, because probabilistically what he was going to do is squash Peter Parker like a fucking bug and leave his bloody carcass all over the cafe, and then he would have no one to ask about Spider-Man, and he'd have to go back to Harry Osborn and be like, I threw a car at him, I murdered your best friend. I thought it would get his attention, I murdered your best friend.
But if you look at it the other way, if Peter doesn't get killed by the giant car thrown at him, it's an intimidating fucking move. You know?
Is.
Like, that fucking works, man. Like, you throw a car at a motherfucker, it's like, they're going to listen to what you have to say.
Yes. That is a great shot. The whole thing where, like, he dives with Mary Jane out of the way, and then he, like, has to tilt his head back a little bit as the wheel is just coming over his head. I've always remembered that. It's just a pretty good money shot there.
Yeah, and then Peter and MJ stand up, and then you get the dong, and then, like, the camera zooms in, and reverse shot, dong, camera zooms in on, like, the empty street, reverse shot back on Peter. It just does that a couple of times as Doc Ock is thumping closer and closer to them. This is a great little bit.
Good stuff there. All right, and so he kidnaps MJ. We get the entire train sequence. Oh, boy, that train sequence, man. It's so... I always forget just how good it is. It helped this time I'm watching the 2.1 version, which adds in a couple more action beats, and I actually think they're pretty good. I would maybe keep those in if I were doing some kind of hybrid cut of these movies, which I'm thinking about I could do. It would be very easy to make a hybrid cut of these movies.
Yeah.
Maybe I should just do that for us so we can have that. But yes, it's a great action sequence. It is a defining Spider-Man action sequence for the way it ends with him, nearly breaking his body to save these people. I think you've said this on the podcast before, but, like, if you're thinking of, like, Spider-Man action, like the kind of exertion Spider-Man puts himself through, this is, like, the go-to thing you think of, right? Especially for a live-action movie.
No, absolutely. It's just the thing with Spider-Man. I always find the, like, Spider-Man sort of having to exert himself in this, like, extreme physical way to save people is, like, I don't know, there's something about that works so well for me with him. In a way, because he's such a grounded, sort of, like, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man kind of character that the focus with him is so much on saving people more than it is on beating the crap out of the supervillain. And so these scenes in these movies and in comic books and stuff, I always just love. But yeah, Spider-Man 2 has among, if not, like, the best version of that. Because it's just so dramatic, and the build up to it of, the whole fight with Dr. Octopus. I love when fucking Doc Ock uses his arms to just rip the fucking accelerator off the train and just, like, chucks it off the train, just, like, fucks off somewhere. It's like, well, shit, gotta deal with this now. And then the slow build up as Peter's, like, tries out a couple of things. He fucking almost breaks his legs trying to sort of, like, break the train that way. And then he, like, comes up on that web plan. And yeah, there's just the slow build-up of that sequence, and then just, like, this is the best I've got. I web up these buildings, and I just hold on, and I hope this works. And he just fucking just does it. He just holds on until the train almost kills him. It's that great shot, like just sequence of shots as he's holding it, and he just gets pulled into the train, and the windows fucking shatter, and it zooms in close on the suit, and the suit is getting ripped apart because of how just like torn apart he is as a person at this point. It's just an amazing little sequence, and again, the focus on him trying to save people more than him trying to fight someone is what is more interesting to me. And I think that's what makes the scene as tense and exciting and kind of gratifying as it is when he finally succeeds to, great personal harm.
Oh, absolutely. It's so good. And we should not neglect the first part of the sequence where he and Doc Ock are just going at it, because that is a great fight. I would not at all mind. If they want to do Doc Ock again, this version of Doc Ock is different enough from comic book versions. I think you could very easily do Doc Ock again in a film without making it echo Alfred Molina. And I would love to see Tom Holland's Spider-Man, like with his, more gadget-prone style, going up against a more modern Doc Ock. That could be fun. But I still can't imagine a better choreographed fight between Spider-Man and Doc Ock. It's just they use the 4 mechanical arms and Spider-Man's powers and the New York architecture. It's all just so exquisitely done. And then it builds to that emotional climax. I think this is a great use of Peter taking off his mask. This movie does a very good job at key points. Peter's going to take the mask off, and it's not just so Tobey Maguire can be a movie star. It's because, Peter is doing something emotionally driven here where we can't let the mask do the talking. And this is one of those sequences where if he had the Spider-Man mask on while he's trying to stop that train, it would not read as powerfully to me.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And then, of course, it gives the sequence this great emotional kick at the end where the people carry him back, and he's all freaked out because he doesn't have his mask, and they're all like, it's okay, we're not going to rat you out. And the little kids bring him the masks. It's a gorgeous little sequence. And I love that all the New Yorkers stand up for him at the end and say, you're going to have to go through us. And then Doc Ock is like, all right. And he goes through them. And then Spider-Man goes with him. Just great stuff across the board. Yeah,
I'm always sort of surprised at how when Spider-Man is carried, just how Jesus-y that is. And something I don't think I had ever quite caught is he's straight, it's so Jesus-y to the point that he straight up has a cut underneath one of his ribs where the suit is ripped and there's blood coming out. It's like, oh, right, Jesus, spear, oh, right.
Yes.
Martyr.
It is very Jesus-y. It does not annoy me in the way Zack Snyder's incessant Jesus-y stuff with Superman is.
No, because it's this one scene, and it's referencing the martyr-like aspect of Spider-Man that is very much there, of him putting himself through extreme personal turmoil for the benefit of people that he doesn't even know.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we have the scene with Harry Osborn trying to kill Spider-Man. Not much to say there, except I did want to mention that if people think sometimes movie trailers give away a little too much now, I remember every piece of marketing for this movie had the scene where Harry rips off the mask and is about to stab Spider-Man, and you knew going into this movie Harry was going to find out who Spider-Man was. It's at the very end of the fucking movie. They did not give a shit about spoilers in 2004.
No, yeah, it's spoiler culture is a more modern phenomena than I think we ever really realized.
Oh yeah. Okay, so then there is, of course, the final showdown at the docks with the fusion reactor. This is not really an action-driven climax. There is some action, and there's obviously some spectacle here, but it really becomes so much more about the character drama between Peter, Doc Ock, and Mary Jane, in that this is where Mary Jane finds out he's Spider-Man. Spider-Man has to get through to Doc Ock. Doc Ock gets through to himself and makes these final choices about who he wants to be and how to end his life here by doing the right thing. It's a really great sequence and a good example of how, if you've already exhausted your best action sequence, which this movie has done with the train sequence, you don't have to try to one-up yourself, right? You don't have to try to go bigger. You can go more intimate. And that's absolutely what this movie does in its final sequence, and I've really always loved it for that.
Yeah, one thing I love about the conclusion so much about this movie is that it's not about Spider-Man beating up Doc Ock, and once he beats up Doc Ock, he saves the day. It's because that wouldn't fix anything. He needs to convince Doc Ock to do the right thing. It needs to pull him back from the abyss, basically, and kind of bring Dr. Octopus back to like a redemptive arc. And there's something about that is so different. It's so unconventional. Superhero movies almost always end with some sort of final confrontation between the superhero and the supervillain, and the hero wins. And that's just how that works. That's the typical formula. That's not to say other movies have not avoided that, because, other movies have played with it too. But I do love that this movie is so much more about the ideas of heroism than it is about like the violence of heroism, that in its final concluding moments, it is about Spider-Man imparting the lessons that he has learned over the course of this movie onto Doc Ock. Like, quite literally, he quotes Aunt May's whole speech about, having to be steady and give up the things you want the most, even your dreams, if you want to do what is right. And that is what brings Otto Octavius back from the brink and convinces him to stop the fusion reactor and save the day. And there's something so cool about that for that whole final sequence, Spider-Man kind of doesn't have much to do. Like, in terms of like stopping the main threat, his whole concern is like, fucking Doc Ock's going to deal with that fusion reactor thing now. I just have to make sure that me and Mary Jane aren't killed. And that's his whole concern in that whole final sequence. It's not him saving the day. It's him just kind of like trying to maintain things while Doc Ock takes care of shit.
Yes, and Peter Parker is the hero in this last sequence, right? And it's that can be kind of a juvenile thing to say sometimes about these dual identity superhero things, but the point is the identities are pretty well rectified in that sequence, in that he takes off the mask both literally and figuratively, in that he shows who he is to Doc Ock, he shows him his own humanity, trying to bring Otto Octavius's humanity back to him. Taking off the mask also unmasks himself to Mary Jane. It is this kind of unburdening in all directions. It's his own unburdening that inspires Dr. Octopus, and Dr. Octopus, unburdens himself in return and has this, beautiful redemptive ending for the character, including that great final shot where he is like drowning and like going down in the water while the fusion reactor, the sun is just like shrinking and then going away. And like, so it's lit by that sun, and then the light from the scene goes away, and then we cut back to Peter and MJ. But just talk about, all your themes coming together in one great series of moments. This is it. It's such a great conclusion. I remember the rush I felt and the whole audience felt when Mary Jane saw who he was, because that's how this Spider-Man story has to end. She has to find out. That has to be brought together in some way. And I think doing it through this kind of action, and that the reason he doesn't have the mask on isn't because it was ripped off. It's because he took it off to talk to Dr. Octopus. There's so many great little touches there. It's a really perfect climax to the film.
Yeah, I mean, it is something where it's like the whole last 30 to 40 minutes or so, particularly like from Peter deciding, okay, I have to be Spider-Man again, like to the end, is so perfect. Like it's paced perfectly. It is constructed in the perfect way to deliver like everything it needs to about the themes and bring all that stuff home. It is such a powerful, driven climax to a movie.
Yes, absolutely. There's one little note about this whole sequence I want to make, which is at the end where he and MJ are like up on that crane, and then he lowers MJ down so she can get back to shore. I've always thought that looks super fucking painful, where he's letting the web out of his wrist really slowly, like it's like a crane kind of thing coming out of his wrist, because in most Spider-Man stories, it's a web shooter. He does not feel anything. In this, it's like, that would hurt. That's like a needle like going in or out of your skin, and he's doing it like really slowly and with like weight on the bottom of it. I don't know why. It has always made me wince a little bit. It's not supposed to, but it does.
I can honestly say I've never looked at it that way. Maybe it's because in like my head, I always just kind of think web shooters, even if obviously for these it's like the organic power, that I don't consciously think about what the physical sensation of Spider-Man shooting his organic webs must be like. It feels like to me that is to you what the weird cat bus is in Totoro to me. Of like, there's something about like the physical sensation of it that like I have reconsidered from like my perspective. It's like, this is fucked up and weird, and nobody else sees it that way.
Yeah, I don't know why. It's just he's got like a rope coming out of his skin. I'm just saying that would hurt.
No, I'm with you. I just don't see it that way when I'm watching the movie, but I think you are right.
Yes. I mean, I don't know. Do spiders feel pain when they like lower themselves down on a web? Probably not. It's just how it goes. But
asking the philosophical questions here on the Weekly Stuff Podcast. Do spiders feel pain?
All right. The end of the movie. Mary Jane leaves John Jameson at the altar. I do feel bad for John Jameson. He didn't deserve that. We do get J. Jonah Jameson having the great kiss-off line from the movie of, honey, call Deborah. The caterer, tell her not to open the caviar.
It's before that you get that great, like, you know, the shot, the sort of like tracking shot up through the aisle, and then fucking his head just like whoop right into frame. It cracks me up every single time. One thing that, you know, thinking about like from the comic book perspective, one thing they could have done for an alternate Spider-Man 3 is have John Jameson turn into the Man-Wolf, which is what he does in the comic books, because he goes to the moon and finds a magical moonstone that grafts to his flesh and turns him into a werewolf called the Man-Wolf, where he loses all of his sanity, and then he fights Spider-Man because he knows instinctively that Spider-Man took his girlfriend.
They could have done that. I don't know if that would have been better or worse than the Spider-Man. They would have been worse, but that would have been interesting.
I just like the Man-Wolf, you know? That's just me.
All right. So you get that, and then Mary Jane comes and is with Spider-Man. I love how this scene is written. I love how Mary Jane recontextualizes the issue to Peter and says, you don't get to decide that for me. I have to be able to, you know, have weight in this relationship. I forget what the exact line is, but it's something like that, you know, that don't you trust me enough to make my own decision about this? Isn't it time somebody saved you? And she has something else in there about, like, do you really think we should spend our whole lives only being half of ourselves? And it's really beautiful. Yeah. It is so earned. It's 2 movies worth of build-up to these 2 people finally deciding to be together. It is gorgeous. It's such an affirmative moment. And then, because this movie understands its own themes so well, it ends the way it has to end, which is there are sirens outside, a crime is going on, and she understands, and he goes and bees Spider-Man, but that's not the last shot. The last shot is her quietly contemplating what this new life is going to be, and we fade out on that. It's a perfect ending. It's why I say I don't know. We can criticize Spider-Man 3 all day long. I have no idea what the next step is after this, because they have just summed up this character's full existence and cut to black. What else do you do?
You put a fucking My Chemical Romance song on it. That's what you do.
It's technically Dashboard Confessional.
I'm sorry.
It's
Dashboard
okay.
Confessional.
Yes.
My mistake. How could I have possibly mixed those 2 bands up?
I don't know. I do like the song. It's probably empty 2000s nostalgia, but I was listening to the song on my iPhone today while driving around doing errands. It's a good song.
Oh, no. I have better Spider-Man music to listen to these days.
That's true.
Like New Point of View or Square Boy.
Okay, Sean, if you had to pick one song from the Rock Reflections of a Superhero soundtrack to play at the end of Spider-Man 2, Mary Jane, she's looking out, she's contemplating, fade to black. Which of the songs on Rock Reflections of a Superhero do you bring in for the end of the film?
I would pick Dr. Octopus Part 2. Hey, Dr. Octa, Dr. Octa, Dr. Octopus.
All right. What do you think about that last scene, Sean?
I just agree with everything. I don't know if I actually have anything to add to it, because I think you said it all perfectly, that it is just the perfect ending to the movie, that the dialogue is so perfect, and you know, Kirsten Dunst and Tobey Maguire obviously have such fantastic chemistry, but it is that little extra touch of they kiss, and in the middle of the kiss, the sirens go, and Spider-Man has to go be Spider-Man, and I do think it's very... almost kind of weirdly haunting the way that they hang on MJ. And that's like the last shot of the movie is hanging on MJ, fading to black, as she's watching Peter fly off to, you know, probably eventually get himself fucking killed as Spider-Man. But like that is the dynamic that the relationship has to be, because he can never not be Spider-Man, I think is what he says.
Yeah. It's so good. Look, she is giving a full performance in that last scene, silently, on her face. It's great. It is, I think, the exact right mixture of sadness and happiness and contentment and contemplation. And, God, like, what others... Again, I hate to make these blanket statements. Superhero movies end on notes of reconciliation. They do not end on notes of contemplation. You know what I mean? Like, this is an extraordinarily contemplative, you go out into the world and keep thinking about this note to end on. And I think that's incredible. And there, you know, I think Dark Knight does something It's also very, it sends you out of the theater thinking about it, but it is also, like, that movie doesn't have a happy ending, but it has this big theatrical soliloquized ending where I don't think it's contemplative in the same way. I'm just trying to go through some other, like Logan has that last shot with the cross and turning it into an X that I think is maybe the closest you would get to it, but that's also about as definitive a conclusion as a movie can have because your main character is literally dead and buried. So, like, this is different. This is something special.
Absolutely.
So here is a legitimate question, Sean. And I think we'll get into this more next week when we talk about Spider-Man 3. If you, in the year 2004, were older than you were like the age you are now, with the Spider-Man knowledge you have now, and you had to make a sequel to Spider-Man 2, what direction do you think they could have gone in? Because I might have an unpopular opinion here, which is that I think the bones of Spider-Man 3 are the right direction.
Yeah, no, I think, well, one, obviously, it would be the Man-Wolf idea I just had. If we don't count the Man-Wolf idea, I think what makes the most sense is to do Harry Osborn turning into the Green Goblin again, and then having the Sandman stuff works for me really well. I think it's kind of hard, and we'll obviously talk about it when we watch Spider-Man 3, and I can reconsider this stuff. But from what I remember, it was kind of hard to fully pull out like all the good Sandman stuff that was in Spider-Man 3 because it had to share so much space with all the Black Suit Venom stuff, which never felt like what Sam Raimi was quite interested in. But I think focusing on sort of Peter's world collapsing around itself because as a supervillain from the beginning who knows that Peter is Spider-Man, that's something that the movies never did. Obviously Green Goblin finds out at the end of Spider-Man 1 that Peter and Spider-Man are the same person, but it would be interesting for them to go for the dynamic of the whole movie is the villain knows Peter and Spider-Man are the same person, and then Peter has to deal with that. And I don't know how you work Sandman in there as well, or some other villain, because I think it would be a hard sell to have 3 Spider-Man movies and 2 of them have the villain be basically a version of Green Goblin. But I think it has to be the Harry Osborn stuff. That has to be the focus of the third movie.
Which it really isn't in Spider-Man 3. It's very ancillary. Yeah. I don't know. I think that would have to be part of it. I don't know how I feel about Venom. I do think the symbiote stuff was the right idea in terms of you start Spider-Man 3 and Peter has his shit together to a certain extent. Like, not my life is perfect. I live in a mansion and I'm, skateboarding across the stage doing high fives. But, like, I have a girlfriend. I'm happy. I'm okay. And then have the struggle come from some kind of internal thing where maybe he is becoming egotistical or he is missing things in the world. He's letting things get the better of him. I think there are some key things that Spider-Man gets right in its thematic direction. I think the blending of all the elements is not good necessarily, but I think the general idea of that Peter being his own worst enemy at this stage, that might be the right direction for a potential Spider-Man 3. But it's hard. I really, there's no one villain that, comes to the top of my mind of, that's who you go after Doc Ock and Spider-Man 2, Yeah. Whereas I feel like after Spider-Man 1, Spider-Man 2 is a fairly obvious direction of what you're going to do. It's the exact same thing as, The Dark Knight or the Star Wars The Last Jedi, which is a still in progress thing, where it's just I don't know what the next part of the story is, because I think you told the story. You told the story.
Yeah.
We'll see. But yeah, any other thoughts on Spider-Man 2 before we wrap it up for today?
It's a hell of a fucking movie, man.
Hell of a fucking movie. Danny Elfman drives this thing. It is a magnificent score. And, God damn it, watching the Spider-Man movies again just makes me realize we should just be harder on movie music today. Movie music fucking sucks these days. It is bland. It has no character to it. It does so little to enhance the emotional or atmospheric elements of movies. For most major Hollywood productions, the music just does nothing. And there are standouts. There's, I think Hans Zimmer generally still does good stuff, obviously. Hans Zimmer, I don't know. It's tough. I'm thinking Dunkirk last year, Blade Runner 2049. Those were both great. And then you can get into some art house stuff, which is a different thing. But I feel like the last gasps of great movie music in giant blockbusters was the end of like the Harry Potter series at the beginning of this decade, and then Hans Zimmer has been keeping the torch alive, and then everything else is just, you know, like it doesn't do anything. Like it's still the biggest weakness of the MCU films. You know, Infinity War and Black Panther are definitely two of the best scores that series has had. There's nothing on Spider-Man music or, you know, Superman music or Batman music or something like that. It's too bad because there's so much room with a superhero story to do good music scoring because it gives you that big, you know, theatrical operatic canvas to operate on. And I don't know. Movie music is in a bad place these days, I feel like.
No, I 100% agree, and it is particularly. I love the sort of the element of like the dueling themes in Spider-Man 2 of the Spider-Man theme and the Dr. Octopus theme.
Yes,
and the way those play off of each other is so beautiful,
so good. Anyway, Spider-Man 2, we're probably never going to see another one like it. It was so good, and next year we will get our third Spider-Man 2 because
I was about to make that joke also
because this series is weird.
Yep, and I can't wait until in 2021 or whenever when we'll be playing Marvel's Spider-Man 2 on the PlayStation 5 or whatever is out then. We've got lots of Spider-Man 2s to enjoy in the future, Jonathan, is what I'm trying to say.
Exactly. Next week on the show, we will be talking Spider-Man, the Insomniac game, Spider-Man 3, the Sam Raimi movie, to wrap up these discussions. Very interested in that one. I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about Dragon Quest XI. We'll see what else happens. It's going to be a busy one. The Spider-Man train just keeps on rolling.
Hopefully I've managed to finish Yakuza Kiwami 2 by then. If not, I don't know what I'm going to do.
You're going to join the actual Yakuza. You're going to fly to Japan. You speak Japanese. Yep. Yeah, you can do it.
It's true, yeah. I think I could cut it. I think I would need to get a big tattoo of a dragon on my back, but once I get that, I'm basically in the Yakuza.
I like the choice of I think I could cut it while talking about the Yakuza, just because, you know, the first thing that comes to most people's minds is cutting off your pinky finger.
I'll try to avoid that.
Okay.
I'll try to not get involved in that deep.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see you guys next week.
I have important breaking news, Jonathan, to end this podcast. My Sony limited edition Marvel Spider-Man PS4 Pro 1TB bundle has now been adjusted its price. I am saving $1.03 on that fucker.